I think we're ready to get started, and not doing too bad, only 4 minutes late. So thanks everybody for joining us. I'm Lisa Clark, I'm the Director of the Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, and this is our, gosh, I should have looked, fourth UP Energy Task Force meeting? Fifth. Thank you, Vice Chairman Prusi, for keeping up on the numbers, I appreciate it. So it's a little bit after 11, and first of all, we've got a few of our task force members who have joined us by phone. I think we've got Douglas Jester. Douglas, are you there?
Yes, I am. Good morning.
Awesome. Tanya Kozlowski.
Good morning.
And Mike Nystrom.
Good morning.
Great, thanks for joining us. Anybody else on the phone? Okay, those of you on the phone, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Great, all right, we'll make sure folks are close to the microphones. I'm told that we have our best sound system yet today, so that'll be helpful. For the first little bit of time here, we're going to do some task force business. And then because of the way our schedule is structured today, we might have a little extra time for some public comment up front. Otherwise, the public comment will be in the afternoon. So just to review the agenda to get started, we'll do some business here. We've got a presentation from Joe Potchin from the Attorney General's office. From 11:30 to noon, and I should mention that we're going to have presenters that are going to communicate with us. They're going to present through the conference line. So we've got a couple of Zoom presenters, and that's one of them. We'll take a lunch break from noon to 1. From 1 to 1:30, we'll have our second presentation on propane pricing from the EIA. That'll also be a conference call in. And then from 1:30 to 2, we'll have a presentation on the work that Public Sector Consultants has been doing on the report. And then we will have opportunity for public comments from 2 to 3:30, and then we'll have a working session from 3:30 to 4:30. So that is the structure of the agenda for today. As a first point of business, can I have a motion to approve the November 13th agenda?
So make a motion.
Okay, we'll call it Tony with the move and Mike with the second. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, so we have adopted the November 13th agenda. Second discussion point, you should have received the October 1st meeting minutes in advance. So first, let's move the meeting minutes and then we can see if there's discussion. So is there a motion to move the meeting minutes?
Move to approve.
Thank you, Jim. Dan with the second. Any discussion on the meeting minutes from October 1st? Tanya, do you have any input on the meeting minutes? Anything you wanted to point out?
No, I think they're great.
Great. All right. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposition? Great. Meeting minutes from October 1st are approved. And for those of you who are following along on the website, we do post the meeting minutes after they've been approved by the task force. So you can now see the meeting minutes from October 1st. Please check our website regularly. You can find all previous recordings of presentations, all previous PowerPoint presentations, etc. on the website. Okay. Continuing through our business. Also wanted to mention that we've been receiving public comment through email that we've been forwarding to all of you. So you should be seeing that there. Let us know if you need to receive that in any other way. So for those of you that are submitting public comment to the task force, that's how it's been received and recorded. Okie doke. Continuing on, wanted to mention for those of you that are going to be considering giving us public comment here today, back at the table on your left, you can find the public comment cards. We ask that you please fill them out. Kimber's got her hand raised over there. And then what we do is we set a time limit of 3 minutes for public comment. We're always happy to receive anything in writing that you want to submit to the task force as well. But we can see how much we get in terms of interest in speaking, and then we can adjust from there. But we'll start with 3 minutes for public comment per speaker. All right, and then I wanted to visit briefly about our next meeting date. Early on, so we had talked about having a December meeting to do business of the task force. So continuing to digest the presentations that we've heard and have a conversation about what we would like to reflect in the report. So we have a tentative date of December 10th. I apologize, I know it doesn't work for a couple folks. But what we're inclined to do, sorry, Tony, what we're inclined to do is actually do a kind of bifurcated meeting where we open up a line at Northern and we open up a line in Lansing. Okay, people are shaking heads, and so the inclination would be that, folks can gather in Marquette, and then folks can gather in Lansing, and we'll communicate together that way. So hopefully that works to make sure that we've kept as much north of the bridge as possible, but we're also since we're not having presentations, we'll limit the traffic. Sorry.
And open public line.
And we'll open a public line. Yep, thank you, James, good addition. Okay. Let's see, that's, I think, all I've got on my notes here. Any questions from task force members that you'd like to ask with anything I've presented this morning? Yes.
Had we originally talked about the December 10th meeting being in Roscommon?
We had talked about it being in Roscommon. Would you prefer that it's in Roscommon?
I do not.
Okay. Duly noted, Jim. Jim says no to Roscommon.
I do not, but it was just that I wanted to make sure I wasn't missing a different date that was earmarked for Roscommon.
Yeah, the thought was, does Roscommon really help anybody? I mean, no offense to Roscommon. Lovely town. Was recently through there, we'll be through there later tonight. But just thought it probably made more sense to just make things as easy as possible for folks.
Understood.
Okay. And we, again, it's easier to teleconference in when you've got a place where the logistics are all going to work well, and that Northern's been true for us on that count. So that was the reason for Northern. But if you have thoughts about a better location too, I was open thinking about where the right place is together.
Yeah, if convenient, we have a room at Northern too that will certainly house this group as well that we train with them. So if you need our involvement, let us know.
Okay. I appreciate that, Jen. Thank you. Other thoughts on anything I've mentioned here this morning?
Is there a plan then, knowing that we're forced in March, for January, February?
Yeah, so we've got some, we've done some triangulating on dates. I just don't have those ready for you yet here today, so we'll have them to you soon, certainly before December 10th, to get your feedback on. Thanks, that's a good point, Jen. Thoughts? Anybody else? All right, with that, I think what we'd like to do is take a little bit of public comment before we do the 11:30 presentation by the Attorney General's office. Kimber's brought me a couple of cards. I don't know if there's anybody else that would like to give Kimber a card, but feel free. We will take comment this afternoon too. I just want to be clear. We just want to, create more opportunities. So we'll just take a second and set up. Yeah. Tony doesn't need a mic. I'm just kidding. You can take my mic. All right. Okay, so I've got a couple of cards here. So I'd like to invite first, is it Jean Seekley from Marquette? If you'd like to give us comment, thank you. Thanks for using the microphone. That'll capture it for all of us,
Sure.
and then make sure our folks on the phone can hear.
Okay. Yes, my name is Jean Seckley. I live in Marquette, Michigan, the past 11 years. I appreciate all the hard work that this task force is doing to help ensure reliable, affordable energy to heat those thousands of UP homes. 35 years ago, my husband and I built a house near Grayling with a closed passive solarium to the south-facing driveway. The tax deduction that we were able to take on that modest starter home was substantial. We were surrounded by forest, and on one side was a cold river valley. But with that passive solarium, which would heat to 95 on a winter day, we rarely had to use the furnace in the winter during the day. Michiganders are smart when we put our minds to it and when local and state government reward energy efficiency. There are multiple energy companies in the UP, and during these coming years, we do need to guarantee an uninterrupted supply of propane for those customers depending on it. With that, I do not believe that Enbridge's Line 5 pipeline can be counted on. The aging line is prone to disruption in the 280 miles it runs between Superior and Rapid River. Should it fail west of us, I do not believe it would be the top priority of Enbridge and its affiliates to drive around filling propane pigs throughout the UP while trying to get that precious pipeline flowing again. Additionally, at any time, with any corporation, Enbridge could decide to abandon this route. Corporations change their business plans as markets and CEOs change. Michigan's been a wonderful neighbor to this foreign giant for 66 years, but it's time now to end their dependence on us. The bottomlands of Lake Michigan, which belong to all of us, need not be given away to private management. So I ask you to be proactive and get the market to be competitive. Open up the market. There are other propane providers already working in the UP, bringing propane from central Wisconsin and from the Sioux area. There's more than one way to provide our energy needs here above the Mackinac Bridge until we can transition Michigan to cleaner and more sustainable energy. Thank you.
Great. Right on time, look at that. You don't even have to have the dinger go off. All right, next I'd like to invite up John Forslund, who is also from Marquette, Michigan.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Thank you for being here once again. By email at 1 o'clock this morning, I sent you a copy of this document, 100% Michigan. It's the Solutions Project, a prescription for Michigan for being 100% renewable by 2050, using only existing off-the-shelf technology and designed ideas. Rocky Mountain Institute has made a similar proposal on parallel kinds of lines. That's where we have to end up. We're killing the planet otherwise. Every time you burn fossil fuels, you kill somebody. I have a question, or rather a pre-comment for the price of propane guy later. Is he adding the social cost? 9 million people worldwide die from air pollution. Is that part of the cost? So just want to remind everybody on behalf of the Climate Reality Project, keep it in the ground. Thank you.
Thank you, John. All right, so those are the cards that we have right now. Peter?
Can I just make a quick?
Only if you fill out a card in the 3 minutes, Peter.
You can fill it out later.
Okay. Yeah, you can fill it out later too. Do you want to, I mean,
Fill it out later? Okay.
but it's your, I mean, yeah.
I will fill it out later.
Okay.
Okay, promise. Just want to make a quick announcement early on. I'm Peter Sinclair, and I'm going to be directly after this meeting here in this room, we'll have a presentation on just sort of basic global 50,000-foot view of solar energy, because solar energy is going to be very important here in Michigan if we are going to take the next step and move off of the fossil fuel regime. So you're all invited. We have invited the larger community through social media. We hope some other folks will show up as well. But it should be interesting, and we may have a special guest Skyping in to help us answer questions as well. It shouldn't last too long, and lots of good media and graphics, and it should be fun. So thanks.
Thanks, Peter. Okay. Oh, we got a card? Great, thank you. Appreciate that. All right, I get to invite Ralph up, or Ralph invites himself up. Thank you, Ralph.
A.G. Dana Nessel wrote an editorial that was published in our newspaper maybe a month or a month and a half ago. I'm sure it was published throughout the UP. But she made some claims that I think are untenable and impossible. She said that we would go to alternative propane supplies that bypass Line 5 within 2 years. Enbridge says they can get the tunnel bored through bedrock in 4 years, so that leaves a 2-year gap. If you transport it by truck, it's prohibitively expensive. If you transport it by rail, it's still far more expensive than a pipeline. So the question is, would it be better to to keep Line 5 in commission until they can bore through the bedrock. I mean, the bedrock tunnel, no matter how you leak it, it's not going to get through rock. It's not going to get to the water. Next, we in the UP talk about propane as being like that's the only problem. It's not. This petroleum leaves Michigan and Sarnia. Down there's tens of thousands of people who are employed in turning that petroleum into car fuel, jet fuel, diesel fuel, or boat fuel. And we forget about those jobs that are going to be impaired if we shut down Line 5 for at least 2 years and maybe more. I don't have anything more to say.
Thank you, Ralph. Appreciate that. All right, so for those that might be interested in speaking this afternoon, feel free to fill out a card and reach out to Kimber. And we've got a couple of minutes now to get dialed into the next presentation at 11:30. I don't know what time we expect them. So we'll go at ease for just a couple of minutes while we take care of the technology pieces. So Joe Potchin, the Attorney General's Office. This is Lisa Clark, Director of the Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy. I'm the Chair of the Upper Peninsula Energy Task Force. So the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to go around and say name and affiliation for Joe so he knows who all is on the task force. So we're going to start in the room, and I'll go to my right to Mike. Oh, and I got to share the mic.
I'm Mike Percy. I'm the Governor's Northern Michigan Office Director.
Mike Formansky, Electric Superintendent for the City of Escanaba.
Michael Larson with Michigan Energy Options.
Not everybody on the task force is named Mike.
Seems that way.
Jen Hill, Citizen Utility Board of Michigan, and recently elected Mayor Pro Tem of Marquette.
Congratulations.
I'm Tony Ratajski. I'm with the Upper Peninsula Construction Council.
And I'm Jim Kuchever. I'm the General Manager of Cleveland Cliffs, Michigan Operations.
Chris Bowman Gas for propane retailing.
Tom Harrell, CEO at Elder Delta Cooperative Electric Association in Gladstone, Michigan.
Dave Camps, business owner of Pluterra Energy.
Tanya Sweetar, Program Manager, Superior Watershed Partnership.
Roman Sidertz, Assistant Professor of Energy Policy, Michigan Tech.
Dan Scripps, Michigan Public Service Commission.
Okay, can we go around on the phone, please? How about Douglas first?
This is Douglas Jester, Managing Partner of Five Lakes Energy. Tanya, go ahead.
This is Tanya Kozlowski with the, thanks Mike. This is Tanya Kozlowski with the Michigan Electric and Gas Association.
And this is the last Mike Nystrom with the Michigan Infrastructure and Transportation Association.
And then did I hear one more beep on the phone? Okay, might have made it up. Great, so Joe, that's us. Take it away.
Okay. All right, so I'm with the Corporate Oversight Division in the Department of Attorney General. And as one of the things that we do in the Corporate Oversight Division is that we enforce the Michigan Consumer Protection Act. That is why we were tasked earlier to take a look at, what additional things can we do in our office, or what additional proposals we have to enhance the Michigan Consumer Protection Act, specifically when it comes to such issues as gasoline and propane, one of our top consumer complaints. And as a result of that, when we've seen areas of high volatility, particularly with energy products like propane or gasoline, I can only think, for example, of the 2013-2014 polar vortex, when there was a huge spike in propane prices, especially in the UP. What can we do to address those things? So I guess while we have the Michigan Consumer Protection Act as one possible avenue, we propose even stronger laws to address products like gasoline and propane. And that's my understanding of why I'm here today to talk to you about that. And many states have specific laws relating to price gouging and energy products that are really, frankly, better than our laws. We've looked at laws from Illinois, Vermont, Rhode Island, Maine, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, New York, and California. And I want to be real clear, I'm not proposing a replacement of the Michigan Consumer Protection Act. We're looking into enhancing it, again, particularly relating to energy products. So what are some of the issues that we are looking to address with the Consumer Protection Act? In particular relating to price gouging, a term that we all hear when it comes to gasoline products or energy products. The current prohibition of price gouging is a little bit unique in some states. Under the Michigan Consumer Protection Act, charging a consumer a price that's, I'm sorry, I have to look at different screens here. A consumer a price that's grossly in excess of a price at which similar property or services are sold. What that does, that if everybody increases prices, it doesn't really come into play. So if you have a lot of gasoline stations all of a sudden raising their prices, that's not charging an amount grossly in excess of a price at which similar property or services are sold. There could be other provisions like antitrust provisions or something like that, but price gouging may not necessarily be implicated. So we look to fix that by comparing pre and post disruption prices, not prices charged at the same time as other sellers. So we talk about something in the proposed, do you have a copy of the proposed legislation there? Have you seen that? Okay. The proposed legislation looks at excessively increased price, means a price that demonstrates an unjustified disparity between the price before and after a market disruption. And I'll get into a market disruption in a bit. So we look at what happens there. The current Michigan Consumer Protection Act doesn't specifically provide parameters for dealing with the seller's cost. Current standard, again, looks at prices grossly in excess. It's necessarily vague, but it provides little guidance to businesses of the costs associated with selling a product. So we look to fix that in two ways. We look to fix it by creating a presumption that an excessive price, if it goes above more than 10% during a market disruption, unless it's the increased price is due to increased costs. So we look to give the sellers the ability to explain why did you raise the prices so much, and if it is due to increased cost, that kicks into provision where we can apply further up the chain. The current Michigan Consumer Protection Act only applies to direct sales to consumers. So when we look at something like gasoline or propane, consumer pricing is the tail end of the distribution chain, and we want to go up further. So we want to go look at who the wholesalers are, producers. Why is the price so high? And if you just go to the gas station or the propane seller, they may say, well, that's what we were charged. So we look to go up the chain of command there. So some key points in legislation that we've proposed, which we believe could be enhanced by stronger legislation, is that we look at market disruption as being the trigger, not just excessively high prices. But the notion of gouging is based on the idea that sellers are taking advantage of buyers during unusual market events. So while many states have anti-gouging provisions that are triggered by a declared state of emergency, we look to avoid this trigger because that doesn't cover the pricing volatility that occurs during a storm or other events that's threatened. Many situations like the BP refinery breakdown, there was no state of emergency declared, but the markets were clearly disrupted. So we have an elastic definition in the statute that allows for some flexibility, and that's defined where we have market disruption on the definition in section 2. Some states have a similar trigger. Connecticut, Illinois, Maine, and Massachusetts, they have all different triggers for when such market disruption would apply in what we're talking about. Again, charging an excessively increased price is prohibited. The notion of price gouging is that sellers are using an excuse to overcharge consumers and make excess profits. So this draft legislation compares pre- and post-disruption prices, not just prices charged by the same time by other sellers. We also retain some flexibility as to what prices are too high. The 10% threshold gives some guidance without unnecessarily cabining in that in the statute. So we give the guidance of the 10% increase, but a markup that's less than 10% still could be unjustified. So we use that language, unjustified disparity, when we're talking about excessively increased price. We do limit it to energy products. It may occur with other consumer goods, but things like gasoline and propane, they're essential for consumers who may have little choice when buying these products. Again, it extends up the supply chain. This isn't unusual. Pennsylvania and New York have similar statutes that go up the supply chain. Again, we look at before and after the market disruption. A lot of times with products like gasoline and propane, once consumers get used to paying a high price, they forget that it was raised. And so we want to have some control over, hey, why are you still selling this high price when you've justified it by a market disruption? And why are you keeping it that high? That disruption no longer exists. So we want to look at afterwards and making sure the prices go down to reflect reality. Other states have similar timing provisions. California, it lasts 30 days following a declaration of an emergency. New Jersey statute also lasts for 30 days after the claim of an emergency. Another provision that we have in here is that it gives the Attorney General the power to investigate. Under the Michigan Consumer Protection Act, we have to petition the court to issue subpoenas. However, under the antitrust statute, we can just go ahead and investigate and seek information. So we incorporate that investigation tool from the Michigan Antitrust Act. And we also want to make sure that it remains, proprietary information remains confidential. So we have confidentiality provisions in there, unless we bring suit, try to work things out or get information. But if we bring a lawsuit, there's provisions for that. But there's also continued provisions, and that would be in section 4 of the proposed legislation. We don't have a private enforcement provision. That's kind of what we're proposing, simply because, with the Michigan Consumer Protection Act, a lot of people can come in and sue or bring a private cause of action. We're proposing that not be allowed. To make it easier, it would be limited to just Attorney General enforcement. And then we have something, both civil and criminal, that we provide for, and that would be in the latter section of the legislation. So we have both civil penalties, fines up to $10,000 per violation, fines up to $1 million for non-individuals such as corporations, and then criminal penalties, a misdemeanor conviction up to 2 years in prison if it's an individual, and again, there's civil fines as well. And then there's there's a provision regarding witnesses giving testimony. So that's an overview of the legislation that we propose would enhance what can be done in energy products, particularly propane, particularly dealing with, I'm not sure how cold it is up where you are now, but I'm sure that there's a strain on the market up there as we speak. So I hope that, I know that was a quick overview, but I don't know if you have any questions or ideas of what we're talking about regarding this proposed legislation.
Yeah, thanks for the overview, Joe. This is Lisa. I appreciate it. So just wanted to mention for those in the room who may not have participated in previous sessions of the task force that we did a presentation for the Attorney General's office in the last session up in the Sioux that sort of set up this continuing conversation about understanding what governs propane prices right now, which is, as the task force is aware, propane structure is very unregulated. And so the question was, what were some possibilities coming out of the Attorney General's office about what might that look like in the case of an emergency? Joe, I appreciate the overview and the setup, and folks do have in front of them kind of the summary document as well as the draft language that you all have thought about. I guess I got a couple of questions, and I think I should say too at the outset, we'll have a working session this afternoon for the task force, and the task force can then discuss, like, is this something that the task force is interested in being part of the content? I don't know, so I don't want to presuppose that. It was just that since the Attorney General's office had a conversation about this, it seemed relevant to the work of our team. So I don't want anything to presuppose an outcome here, but I do think it's useful to have some questions of Joe.
And we'll post this on the website.
And we'll post this on the website, thanks, James, as well. and Gesundheit. So my initial question, Joe, from your presentation, the first is, you use a definition of market disruption. I'm just curious, does that exist in statute anywhere else right now in MCL? And is that a common definition?
Is it a common definition? I missed you a little bit. Is it a common definition or is this defined anywhere else?
Both questions. So
Okay.
first, do we have market disruption?
Yes,
Yeah, go ahead.
It is somewhat unique in the sense that most states that have this have the declaration of an emergency. We look to broaden it a little more to address situations where an emergency isn't declared. So that is unique. We don't know this is defined in any other state statute. And I'm trying to scroll back to the what other states. Connecticut, so this was developed from Connecticut, which has abnormal market disruption or any period with the imminent abnormal market disruption is. So they don't have specifically the key to declaration of an emergency. Some states do, California does, other states. So 4 states specifically have abnormal market disruption and are not triggered by the declaration of an emergency. And that we just believe that it's more encompassing to situations that we have seen where the prices spike and there's no real explanation as to it.
So Joe, can you talk a little bit more about the differentiation between a market disruption and a declaration of emergency? I'm not real deep in that area of statute, so I don't fully understand how those powers exist.
So when we're talking about a market disruption, I'll take the BP refinery specifically as to that situation. When that situation occurred there, I believe it was a fire that occurred at the BP refinery. I can't recall what led to what happened, but it closed down. There wasn't a declaration of an emergency, but it surely disrupted the production at the facility. And we saw a big increase in gas prices. So that's the kind of situation we're talking about. It's where the state doesn't necessarily, the governor doesn't necessarily sign a declaration of an emergency, but certainly it's a situation where what resulting from the situation is an increase in the pricing. Does that help?
Yeah, that helps. And so you said 4 states have a market disruption statute?
Yes, yep. Connecticut, Illinois, Maine, and Massachusetts.
Okay, great. That's really helpful for me. Other questions from task force members? Go ahead. Sorry. I'm going to share the mic.
Seeing that this is a proposed Energy Pricing Protection Act, have people in your legislative liaisons division shop this around to see if you have any representatives or senators who are willing to formally introduce this legislation and work it through the process?
I believe they're looking into that, yes.
Thanks, Joe. Your definition of energy product specifically calls out gasoline and propane, and then is sort of catch-all other essential energy-based products that are vital and necessary for the health, safety, and welfare of Michigan citizens. I guess I'm curious if you have thoughts on how broadly that would be applied. Is there a market penetration threshold? Is it, there are a lot of folks up here, for example, and in other rural parts that use firewood for heat. Does that now fall under an essential energy-based product? I guess I'm looking for the parameters of the broader definition beyond gasoline and propane.
And at this point, the focus was gasoline and propane because that's what we deal with. However, in this proposal, and like you said, firewood may be a great example of an essential energy-based product. That's how people heat their homes. So we didn't want to limit it into just our view of what may be an essential energy product because we don't know how that can be further defined. I think that this, as we've drafted it, it could be more fine-tuned to define other specific areas. Firewood is not something that I particularly thought of, and And I think that it's a good example that we didn't want to be couched into just dealing with propane or gasoline when many people use firewood as again, an essential product to heat their home. So again, when we were looking to draft the legislation, we want to protect the consumers and the people who are impacted. And we'd like to, make sure that we could cover everything.
Other questions? Yeah, Roman?
Thank you, Joe, for your presentation. Can you hear me?
No, microphone, yeah, I can see you grabbing one.
Okay, so can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, so I was wondering, how do you see the timelines for this enforcement process? Is it intended to provide sort of a remedy after the fact, after the, say, price gouging occurred? Or do you think it might contain an expedited, some kind of a process to stop ongoing price manipulation?
So we're not going to know about the price gouging until we receive the complaints. To the extent we have the ability to take action, a lot of times from our office, we send a letter and we have the backing of a strong law. That energizes the company to take quicker action, let's put it that way. That simply through making them aware of this law that we're investigating, please respond. So having that backing does give us power, so that's a good way to expedite it. To the extent that we would have to take a lawsuit, we would do a longer investigation, but again, having the backing of especially criminal penalties, that does spur quicker action.
Thank you.
Other questions? Yep.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Are you relying solely on consumer complaints, or is there someone in one of the enforcement divisions or regulatory agencies that would be empowered to file a complaint on behalf of a class action or whatever?
I think the law would allow us to take any sort of way it's brought to our attention, and that would be from a regulatory agency or a consumer complaint, or even the seller if he's claiming that he's forced to raise the prices. So I think that there's no limitation on how we can start an investigation or how the information is brought to our attention. And I think we can take action on just about anything that brings it to our office's attention.
Thanks.
Jen?
It's very common for propane prices to change seasonally, and often I think they would trigger their thresholds in the way that it operates right now, where if you can fill up in the summertime, you're going to get a much better deal. That kind of thing. I wonder how that would apply in this situation.
I couldn't hear the question, but I understand that propane is seasonal and the prices change seasonally. Is that?
Yeah, that's correct. And of course, there's an effort to encourage folks who are able to take supply and use storage in order to even out those peaks and valleys to do so. And so how would that apply in the case of this statute?
Again, you're looking at unjustified disparities. So that's necessarily vague to deal with situations that, obviously people are going to take advantage, they're going to store up to the extent they can, but we're focusing on, why the increase. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I mean, we understand there's going to be peaks and valleys in pricing, but whether it's justified or not is a different question. And again, it might just be there's a huge demand at the beginning of the season because people are storing up for the winter. That's justified.
Yeah, go ahead, Michael.
This is Michael Larson. Quick question. Historically, how many complaints have you received around kind of propane pricing? And maybe that includes 2013. And if you have some idea on that with this new legislation, have you been not able to kind of pursue any of those complaints previously? And with this new legislation, will allow you to kind of take on a larger number of investigations, I guess.
So I can't tell you I don't know the specific figures on the number of complaints, but I can tell you back in 2013, 2014, We did take actions against AmeriGas and Ferrellgas as a result of their pricing. We did use the Consumer Protection Act for that. And then most recently, like last winter, I think there was an increase in complaints, but I don't have the specific figures. And we do have a current lawsuit pending against AmeriGas for some of their pricing issues, which again is not solely related to price gouging, so to say. That was more the later things, but and again, that's under the Consumer Protection Act as well. I can get you the figures if you'd like, if someone wants to request them. Or,
So Joe, I'm sorry to take us back to the beginning, but can you help me understand why this draft legislation would go further than using the Consumer Protection Act?
Yeah. So part of the issues with the Consumer Protection Act is it doesn't apply to business transactions. The Michigan Consumer Protection Act only applies to the sale of consumer goods to consumers. So that's one thing it does, is it applies now to business transactions. The other thing is that if everybody increases prices, there's no price gouging. It doesn't allow for this idea of excessively increased price regarding unjustified disparity. What that means is that if everyone is raising their price, you can't say that's grossly in excess of what similar products are sold. We want to have a trigger that says, you know what, if everyone's increasing the price, there's something going on there, we want you to explain what's going on there. So that's another area where the Consumer Protection Act doesn't necessarily protect consumers. And again, we're trying to figure out some parameters that account for the seller to take action. We're not just looking to go after the sellers of these products, recognizing, again, that it could be something further up the supply chain.
Great, thank you.
I have a question. This is Mike Nystrom. Can I ask one?
Yeah,
Madam
please,
Chair?
Mike, go ahead.
So, throughout the 5 meetings we've had, it seems to me that the challenge with pricing really is at the wholesale level in the Upper Peninsula. I mean, based on what I've seen, I don't see the retailers being our challenge. Yes, there can be times when a certain retailer, it seems, based on the complaints and the issues that you've had with those companies you mentioned, may have been retailers. But it seems as though the information we've received is leading me, at least, to believe that it's more at the wholesale level. So how would this whole process review wholesale pricing when we have such a limited number of wholesalers? And second level of the question is can you, through the Michigan Attorney General Office, look at wholesale pricing regionally in the U.S. to know if there is some price gouging happening by a wholesaler in the UP?
So I think to answer the first part of your question is that this does apply up the supply chain. We talk about the chain of distribution. So that would apply to the wholesalers. The second part is how do we look at outside state entities doing business in Michigan? It's going to be a little more of a challenge, but I think that we can, if we're innovative in our thinking, we could probably find a way to look at how we deal with those particular businesses or the wholesalers.
But as a follow-up, they may not be doing, the comparisons may not be doing business in Michigan, is my point. So we can
I think that would be a challenge
then. Prices are a little more controlled regionally in Minnesota, Wisconsin, whatever, at the wholesale level, and yet the wholesaler that is doing business in Michigan, in the UP, may have a price, significant price increase at certain times of the year, i.e. right now. And
right.
So can you look at those other ones as a comparison? You aren't putting violations against those other ones, but do you use the other state information?
I see. So you're saying that the wholesaler, to assert that the wholesaler doing business in Michigan is not doing anything other than any other wholesaler any other around the country?
Yeah, regionally probably is the best
Yeah.
example.
That's, you know, I hate to give you the lawyer answer, it depends, but we could probably look into, I guess I could say look into it, but there's probably other factors that might come into play as to how we would compare a wholesaler doing business in Michigan to wholesalers doing business outside of Michigan, and how we would determine whether that falls within the parameters of what we're talking about here. That's probably a question I can't answer today, and I'm not sure if we want to do that right now. Let's again, let's look at how this comes into play, and then we can always look to expand or take further action or see what tweaking needs to be done at a later point.
I'm not suggesting that I see that. It just seems as though our limited wholesale competition is to me, one of the potential challenges that we have in the UP, and so keeping an eye on that is certainly something that I would think that we would want to consider as a recommendation in the future.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Mike, and I think it also feeds into the deliberative conversation of the task force later this afternoon, too. I think that's a really good point.
Okay.
And I would also mention, no, I'm glad you raised it. I would also mention that the 1 o'clock presentation from EIA, the Energy Information Agency, is specifically going to be on propane pricing, so I think that'll be interesting as well.
I just had to make sure I asked one question so you knew I was paying attention.
I know you're always paying attention, Mike, always. All right, other questions for Joe? Great, well, Joe, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate you giving this overview, and yeah, it's been great. Thanks for letting us ask you lots of questions.
All right, thank you very much for the opportunity.
All right, and with that, we're gonna let Joe go. Thank you, Joe. And to those of you on the phone, we're going to take a break. So we've got lunch now from noon to 1. We'll be back here just a little bit before 1 to get the video conference set up, and we'll do it a second time and hear from EIA. So thanks, everybody.
Just call the same number?
Just call the same number.
All right, thank you.
Yep, thanks, Mike, Tanya, and Douglas. Great, okay. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. So first, this is Lisa Clark. Who do we have on the phone? Douglas, Tanya, Mike? Is that Tanya?
This is Douglas.
Douglas?
Yeah, Mike's on.
Mike, Tanya?
Yeah, she's in.
Yes, I'm on.
Great. All right, so we're reassembled in the room. Okay, so we're going to get started with our presentation from the Energy Information Agency. So I'd like to welcome Warren Vilcheski, and then I think we also have another project partner on the phone line. Is that Alice?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry, this is Alice Woodford, morning TSC.
Great, thanks Alice for joining us. Great, with that, I'm going to hand it over to Warren.
My name is Warren Vilcheski. I'm with the Energy Information Administration, and just to recap, EIA is a non-policy, non-regulatory statistical agency of the United States government. We're created by an act of Congress, and we are, while part of the Department of Energy, independent in terms of the analysis and the data that we publish. So, having trouble skipping, so bear with me. Okay. Go. So just to recap, when it comes to propane, infrastructure continues to evolve. More pipelines become operational, and as a result, less of the product is actually moving by rail than it had even 2 years ago. Producers are behaving in a very logical manner to maximize revenue, and that means looking for markets that provide year-round demand with highest what's called netbacks, value to producer minus whatever logistical and processing costs are involved in the moving of the commodity that's floating in this case. When it comes to the Midwest market, most of the demand continues to come from the residential, commercial, and the agricultural sectors. Both of these are highly seasonal and weather dependent. And when it comes to supply into the Midwest, especially the northern tier states like Michigan, the Dakotas, Minnesota, Wisconsin, a lot of the supply continues to come from Canada. And even though there are a lot of, let's say, notions about the United States being oversupplied with propane, the fact of the matter is that it's not always, the demand is not always where the supply is. And this is actually what the next slide speaks to, which is propane-oriented infrastructure, right? And here, what I really wanted to emphasize are the 3 bullets on the left, because even though in each case, what we are really talking about are developments that are thousands of miles away from where you are in the Upper Peninsula, in fact, all of these developments directly affect the availability of propane into the Midwest and into the Upper Peninsula, into all the sectors, including residential, commercial, and agriculture. So going from top to bottom, Mariner East 2. So Mariner East 2 came online on the 28th of December of last year. So for all intents and purposes, we can consider this to be a first half 2019 project. So are the other projects that I'm going to be speaking about. And once Mariner East 2 came online, not only did more propane and butane move from Ohio out to the Marcus Hook terminal, but in fact, the availability of pipeline transportation for producers in the Appalachian Basin has allowed for that product to move to the highest netback market, which is either the retail market in Pennsylvania, there are a number of terminals along the path of the pipeline there, as well as the Marcus Hook export terminal in the Atlantic Basin. So not only Europe, but believe it or not, even West Africa and the Caribbean and sometimes Latin America actually receive exported volumes from Marcus Hook, right? So this propane that's seemingly landlocked is now reaching water and going all around the world. When it comes to Sterling 3, that pipeline originates at Conway, right? So Conway has, for decades, been the main supply hub for the Midwest. And in this case, what we have seen is a kind of oversupply, you could say, in the mid-continent. There hasn't been really enough transportation capacity to move all the barrels produced in the Rockies and in the Bakken and all of these other regions down to the Gulf Coast. Well, the Sterling 3 pipeline was expanded, and again, very late last year, early this year, by another 75,000 barrels. It may not seem like a lot, but when prices are set on the margin, the availability of that additional capacity to move barrels south from Conway to Mont Belvieu has really moved the field. We'll see that on the next slide. And last but not least, the export terminal at Prince Rupert in British Columbia. So AltaGas, a major producer in the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin, developed Rupert, the Ridley Island Propane and Export Terminal, again, just outside of Prince Rupert. And that terminal is now able to move 30 to 35,000 barrels a day of propane out into the Pacific Basin. So again, Pacific Basin versus Edmonton, at many times of the year, it's like $1 difference. So railing it from Edmonton to Prince Rupert, loading it onto a tanker and shipping it across the ocean, when in fact sail from Prince Rupert to Chiba or to South Korea takes maybe 9 days, is a tremendous improvement over the economics that they previously experienced in Western Canada. Now, in all 3 cases, what this is really leading to is lower supply into the Midwest, right? Because now all of a sudden, the Hopedale rail terminal in Ohio is not loading unit trains that will go to Conway or to Sarnia for storage. All of that propane, or a lot of that propane, is now going to the water to Marcus. The same with Conway. Previously, the price differential between Conway and Mont Belvieu was as much as 30 cents a gallon. The cost of transportation is only 3 cents a gallon. And now, for the first time in years, what we are actually seeing is Conway and Mont Belvieu in the winter moving essentially at parity, right? No longer this 20% discount that was seen just last year. And with Western Canada, it's the same. Now that they can ship into the Pacific Basin, they have less of an incentive to load trains and ship them down to places like Conway. So you see all of these faded lines on the map, those dashed rail delivery paths are now muted because they are not generating the revenue that's comparable to what producers can get by moving product to the water or to more proximate markets. So, and this is the slide that actually shows very clearly the impact of all that infrastructure on price movements, right? So you can see early or even late last year, the difference between Conway and Mont Belvieu was up to 30 cents a gallon, right? By early this year, that shrunk to 3 cents more or less. That's the cost of pipeline transportation from Conway to Mont Belvieu. So here, what we're really seeing is no more pipeline constraints. As much product as wants to can move south. And what we're seeing early this winter, right? These dark lines on the chart are essentially showing that now that there is ample capacity to move product from Conway to Mont Belvieu, if the Midwest wants to keep that propane in the region through higher demand, it must also pay more, right? And that's very logical from a market standpoint, right? You want the product, you have to pay for that product. You can no longer count on infrastructure constraints keeping that product in the region regardless of price. Right? So just with regards to where we are on rail, in early 2017, EIA actually published a new data series on rail movements. I provided a link to that in the slide. This was years in the works, and during that time, we had actually studied and analyzed over 1,000 rail stations that delivered hydrocarbon gas liquids. So that's propane, butanes, propylene. We looked at every station that handles these products since 2010 to assign to them a kind of user qualification. And what we found is that about 3/4 of those stations, in fact, primarily or solely serve the consumer propane market. So stations that you see on the map there have handled over 250 rail cars in a 3-year period of study. Each rail car holds about 700 barrels, so that's about 30,000 gallons, right? So there are many, many more stations, right? You don't see 700 stations on this map. It would look like a meningitis epidemic. But what you do see are the main handling stations, and the smaller ones be taken out because otherwise the map would just be too busy. So shifting focus primarily to the Midwest market, because the residential, commercial, and agricultural sectors are the main drivers of demand, the map that you see in front of you essentially shows propane market share for primary residential heating by county, right? Based on the American Community Survey. Now, what this map does not show is propane being used as a supplementary heating fuel. And this is a very important distinction because what we have seen over the past 10 years or so is a decline in the market share for primary heating fuel, but an increase in propane market share as a supplementary heating fuel. And this is a very important distinction because in many markets, we see air source heat pumps gaining market share. This is normal. More and more people want air conditioning. Rather than installing a dedicated air conditioner, they're putting in a heat pump. Heat pumps are quite effective and efficient at generating heat when ambient temperatures outside are above about 35 degrees Fahrenheit. But you could consider that to be the primary source of heating. However, when temperatures really drop, what you're really looking at is still that supplementary heating source, which in many cases in the Midwest is still propane. The same applies actually to wood, which has gained market share in markets like Michigan or Maine. But when the wood pile starts to run down, or when it's just too outright cold to go outside and to bring that wood inside your stove, propane heaters are still going to come online. And that's unfortunately not reflected in a map like this that only looks at primary sources of heating. right? Secondary sources of heating are surveyed every 4 years. A map I'm showing you now is severely outdated, so this is the best that we can do for the time being. And just to hammer the point a little bit more, if I haven't already, you can see from these charts, on the right-hand side, you can pass to, which is the Midwest. Heating demand is really the primary driver of demand for propane in the Midwest. And you can see a very, very strong correlation between heating degree days, which is a measure of heating demand for space heating, versus actual deliveries of propane into the market in the Midwest. It's almost a 1-for-1 in the winter. During the summer season, there is, of course, things like grilling, water heating. So there's always a baseline that doesn't go down to zero in heating demand, but you can see a very, very strong correlation. So just to emphasize this again, the heating market dominates the market in the Midwest, and as a result, it's a highly seasonal market. And this is important for a number of reasons. So, and I'm sorry, I know I've beaten this dead horse over and over again. We put this into a propane market update every week, which is an analysis of the weather, just because, again, weather is the primary determinant of demand for propane in the Midwest. So you look at weather, you look at these maps, you can more or less deduce where demand is going to go. Now, one of the things that is important is simply that it's not just the departure from normal, but it's, again, how low below freezing does the temperature really go? Because then you don't just have aggregate demand for heating, but you have additional demand for supplementary heating when those primary heating sources are not in effect. So this is a departure from normal. What I would also recommend is every time you're trying to figure out how much demand is out there, also look at how many degrees below 35, 32 degrees Fahrenheit temperatures drop, because then you know that the propane heater is going to kick in, even in a house that doesn't use propane on a regular basis. So aside from heating, we also, of course, have agriculture. One of the things that we had seen early on in this year was a late planting season for corn. So a lot of people had already foreseen a potential for grain drying later in the season. And what you can see there is that, in fact, maturity of the corn crop came in late. Harvest is still coming in. We're only at 50% as of Sunday of this week, of last week. So there's still corn being harvested this late in the season with precipitation and cold weather. That spells high demand for propane for grain drying in the Midwest. There's really no doubt about that, and I'm sure you're hearing that from the field right now, because that's the topic of the town, even here in Washington, when actually today temperatures did drop down to about 35 degrees. So we share your pain. And
Warren, just so you know, I think it's like 10 degrees
just
here.
to show you exactly how, well in advance, it was seen that propane demand for grain drying will be high. What you see on the left-hand side is futures prices for corn during the summer fill season. You can see that they were highly elevated, some of the highest propane corn prices for December delivery that we have seen in the past 10 years. And on the right-hand side, this is actually a map produced by NOAA in June of this year for the main corn drying season. So July, August, September is generally when corn gets its growth spurt. And the forecast at that time was for temperatures on par with or below the 30-year average, right? So it was clear early on that it was a late planting season, and that the corn crop would really not have a chance to catch up because of the cold weather. And as a result, what we saw was, and this is a very interesting indicator, more demand for propane in the Midwest than we would normally see in the summer, right? Now, this really doesn't mean that people are suddenly running their propane-fired furnaces in the summertime. What it really means is that in the market, retailers and agricultural producers are pulling additional barrels of propane out of the wholesale market to keep on hand in anticipation of a significant grain drying season, right? So what we see is 50 to 100,000 barrels in some months above the 5-year average of propane delivered into the retail market or into the end-use market in the Midwest. So that's actually a very positive sign, because what it shows is retailers and agricultural producers were proactive. They saw the corn crop coming in late, they anticipated the grain drying demand, and they started stocking up barrels on hand at the retail level, right? This is actually quite opposite to what happened in 2013 when this line was actually below the 5-year average. So shifting to prices, Alice alluded in emails that we exchanged prior to this that prices were also of great interest to the Energy Task Force. So what we have here are wholesale prices of propane at select locations in the Midwest. I would love for this chart to be busier, not because it dilutes the information, but actually only because that would mean that I would have more data points. In fact, there are many wholesale terminals in the Midwest where daily prices are not reported simply because there is insufficient market liquidity. Bloomberg will usually report prices only if more than 3 participants are active in the market. And as a result, what we are seeing here is New Hampshire, Iowa, Mankato, Minnesota, Rapid River, Michigan, Edmonton, Conway. I'd love to be able to show more, but unfortunately, there just aren't that many other data points to compare this to. But what you do see is 2 things that really stand out. One of them is that Edmonton is now on a tear, right? And this goes back to what I had mentioned early on in the presentation, which is now that they have an outlet in the Pacific Basin, they are really no longer a price taker like they were in the past. So in the past, and I have a slide further down that shows this, Edmonton basically had to take Conway minus 30 cents, more or less, because that's how much it costs to rail propane from Edmonton down to Kansas, right? They no longer have to put up with taking such a significant discount simply because they now have a second outlet. That outlet is a premium outlet. They're shipping more propane into the Pacific Basin. They're no longer shipping as much into the Midwest. And that's just pure economics, right? The other thing, of course, that you see is the runaway in prices. It's like New Hampshire, Iowa. And this is a perfect indicator of corn harvest coming in, going into a dryer, and elevating demand, right? So we already know that the Mid-America pipeline, for example, is on allocation. That means you really can't pull out any more than the quantity that you have signed up for with the operator on the pipeline. And as a result, if you do want incremental barrels, you have to pull them out of local storage, or you have to pay more than somebody else for that same barrel who doesn't want this. Right? So prices, again, reflect supply and demand fundamentals. And that applies to retail prices as well, right? So here, EIA surveys from early October until the end of March, retail prices of propane at every state in the Midwest. There are a number of other states throughout the United States. In the Midwest, we're very lucky because we have essentially 100% coverage. And we're taking those in, we're averaging out with the cooperation of all the states that participate in this program. We're averaging out retail prices for every state and reporting these on a weekly basis every Wednesday, right? So these are prices reported on Monday that are then published by EIA on Wednesday that show what's being charged at the retail level, right? And now this picture is kind of coming together, right? So you've got propane market share, tonality, demand by the various sectors, wholesale prices, and access to wholesale terminals and infrastructure, right? And what you can see there is Michigan, for example, the wholesale prices isn't coming out on the high end, it is coming out on the retail side, right? And this may mean low competition, but in this case, maybe not, because Rapid River is one of the consistently reported wholesale markets in the US. So it may not mean lack of competition, but it may mean some kind of an infrastructure constraint, right? So we know, for example, that the Rapid River terminal and the depropanizer there can only pull out of the Enbridge Line 5 on average, on an annual basis, 2,000 barrels a day of propane, right? 2,000 barrels of propane may be a whole lot in the summertime. It's not all that much in the winter when you look at the market size. The other thing that you need to look at is how rural the demand is, how far retailers have to go from that wholesale terminal out to where the consumer is. And the third thing you need to consider is how much each consumer is actually buying, right? So if you have a market where consumers are using propane as a primary heating fuel, they're probably filling up 200 or more gallons at every fill-up. And they're getting the fill-up, let's say, every 2 months. If you have a market where propane is only a supplementary heating source, maybe people are calling their retailer only once a year. Or if they're getting a fill-up, maybe it's 100 gallons, maybe even less. And as a result, you're going to have higher delivered costs because some of those marginal costs, like putting a driver in a truck and driving out 10 miles, don't change, right, with the volume of delivery, right? So each gallon costs the retailer more to deliver. And if they're delivering less or more, that makes a big difference for the bottom line. So I'm not in the Upper Peninsula. I'm sorry, I can't be with you. So I don't know exactly what the logistics are for the retailers that are operating in that market. But the prices on the retail side suggest to me that if Michigan is a fairly competitive market, which is suggested by the availability of these Bloomberg price series, and yet the price is coming out at the high end, maybe there's a logistical issue, like the fact that only 2,000 barrels is available at the terminal on any given day, or the distances that retailers have to travel, the conditions of the roads, the type of consumer, all these different factors come into play when we're looking at retail prices versus wholesale prices. So when it comes to Rapid River, one of the things that's really important to look at is simply the spread between Rapid River and Edmonton, because we know that the Enbridge Line 5 provides a direct connection between Edmonton and Rapid River, right? And what we're seeing here is the fact that for most of the year, prices at Rapid River, wholesale prices, are coming out above what it would cost to rail product into Rapid River, especially with the presence of a pipeline, which should have an even lower tariff. So what this is suggesting is some kind of a logistical constraint, to be honest with you. Because we're not only seeing that on the retail side, we're also seeing it on the wholesale side. When the spread between Edmonton, the primary source of propane into the Upper Peninsula, and the Rapid River terminal is that high persistently for most of the year, this is suggesting that there is, in fact, shortage of propane due to some kind of a logistical constraint, right? So even if rail is cheaper, maybe there is a lack of terminal capacity, maybe there's a lack of storage on the local level that's precluding those big rail deliveries from actually coming in. Just again, to kind of carve on this, Edmonton has better choices as a result. Edmonton is actually now above Conway. It's the first time in, I would say, at least 5 years. Only time we have seen Edmonton wholesale prices above Conway was in the run-up to the 2013-14 winter, when Edmonton prices started going up before Conway did. So by late November, Edmonton was already, by late November 2013, Edmonton was already above Conway, and this is happening now. So again, local demand, and in this case, exports out of the Pacific coast, are taking propane away that would normally be shipped by rail to the Midwest. And this is also reflected in Canadian inventories, right? So if you look at Eastern Canada, propane inventories there are below the 5-year range, and that's because you have the Hopedale terminal and other sources of Appalachian propane no longer going to Sarnia for storage in the summer, right? They're now going on a pipe and they're going out to Marcus Hook. In the past, we had significant volumes moving from PADD 2 into Ontario for storage in the summer. That's not happening anymore. As a result, storage summer season was low. Stocks didn't build. They're lower now than they were in at least the past 5 years. In the West, very similar story for a different reason, right? Stocks are, again, below the 5-year range. In this case, it's because, again, they're not staying in Edmonton, they're going to the Pacific coast. Year-round demand starting in May when the terminal opened up, and you can see clearly on the dark blue line, right? Early May inventories were in fact higher than early June inventories in Edmonton, right? What happened? Unit trains started loading every other day in Edmonton, shipped the propane out to the island for exports into the Pacific Basin, right? And since that time, those inventories are just not building at the pace that they had in the past. And again, why is this important? It's important because Western Canada rails propane into the upper Midwest, and because Sarnia rails and pipes inventory into Michigan in the winter. There's a direct pipeline between Sarnia and Marysville, and there were rail originations from Sarnia in Michigan. Now all of that is coming down because they have alternate markets. And that's shown in this slide. So what we have on the left-hand side is PADD 2 rail shipments of propane to Canada, right? And you can see spike every summer, right? Summer fill season, not enough demand in the Appalachian Basin. Propane goes on rail, goes to Canada for storage at Sarnia, right? And you can see in each case there is the shift, right? So the propane production has been growing all throughout this period, right? So propane production is growing, shipments to Canada are growing through late 2014. Mariner East 1 starts shipping propane to Marcus Hook. Boom, we have a shift change, right? Then propane production continues to grow, so after a while, that Mariner East 1 pipeline is not keeping up. Again, rail shipments start going to Sarnia to fill up storage. They're high, and then they decline again because now Mariner East 2 begins shipping propane to Marcus Hook, and as a result, we no longer have those summer rail movements of propane from the Ohio production basin out to Sarnia. And, sorry, let me see if this is going to work. Yeah, I'm not sure. Sorry, there's a problem with the way that this slide is coming through. Give me just 1 second, please. So I have another. So the second chart is showing something opposite, which is marine exports out of PADD 1, which is primarily dominated by Marcus Hook, the delivery point for these pipelines, and how much propane is being exported out of the terminal. And you can see the rapid progression of exports, especially since early 2019, right? Pipeline moves propane out of Ohio, out of Pennsylvania, to the water at Marcus Hook, and the propane is leaving the country rather than staying and being injected into storage, let's say in Canada, for delivery to the Midwest. And what we have here is kind of in no uncertain terms what's happening with Canadian propane, right? And in fact, in the left-hand chart, PADD 2 taking the largest hit. So PADD 2 is the Midwest, and deliveries of Canadian propane into the Midwest have fallen more than to any other region as a result of exports out of North America. So the gray part of the chart that just starts to the right, those are all exports to either Mexico or overseas. And most of those volumes are coming out of reduced shipments to PADD 2 to the Midwest. And just to again emphasize this point, right? When you're at Edmonton, which is the dark, the kind of thick line, right? And you are the most heavily discounted market in the world, you're going to look for an opportunity to ship your propane somewhere else. And there's no better market than the Far East, which is at the top of this range, right? So if you have now a marine terminal that's about 600 miles away from the main production region in Western Canada, they have found a way. They're railing into the terminal, they're shipping it out, and you can see the gap closing between the Far East and the Edmonton market. The rest of these charts are a rehash of what we publish every given week in the propane market update. I'm not going to go through them, but I would like to encourage everyone to just take a look, because this deck goes out every week and it has extremely valuable charts that you will not see anywhere else. This chart here does not appear in any publicly available data set that EIA publishes. It's only available in this deck generally by 2 o'clock on a Wednesday. And what you can see here are Michigan inventories, Kansas inventories, on their own. There's no other place that you're going to find these charts. So with that, I mean, this deck will be shared. So if there are any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Great, thank you so much, Warren. Can you hear me?
So I don't think we have good sound, so I'm going to type questions as you say them.
You're going to type questions in? Okay, let me see if I can articulate my question. Well, first of all, can you please tell him thank you?
Warren, I'm going to be typing questions in response to you. Director Clark says thank you and be prepared for questions.
Okay.
All right, I've got a couple, but I'm going to look to the task force members first and see if there's anyone who wants to start. Roman?
Yep.
Sure, go ahead. What's your question?
So, I'm going to convey it to you, right?
Yeah, use the microphone stuff.
But yeah, use the microphone, Roman, so that folks on the phone and.
Well, first of all, thank you, Warren, again. Truly excellent presentation. My question is about his thoughts on about the future of this trend of increased exports. To what extent he, if any insight he can offer on what's the future in what we're seeing right now, what the trend that we're seeing right now.
So the trend for exports essentially is the trend in U.S. production, right? So the domestic market is essentially flat, especially when it comes to the residential commercial market. As I had mentioned, propane is losing market share as a primary heating fuel, while it's growing market share as a supplementary heating fuel. That market is not as large, right? And as a result, aggregate volumes delivered into the residential commercial market in the United States are declining every year, right? The only market in the United States for propane that continues to grow is the petrochemical market, right? And most of that demand is concentrated on the Gulf Coast. So what you're going to see is maybe the petrochemical market growing at slightly higher rates than the residential commercial market shrinking. But for all intents and purposes, you could consider the US market to be relatively balanced or relatively flat, let's say, over the next 10, 15 years. At the same time, EIA and pretty much everybody else actually is projecting continuing growth in propane production in the United States. And what that really means is if you have the domestic market already satisfied, everything in excess of that domestic market demand is going to go to exports. And companies who are in that export business, and even companies who are currently not in that business but operate a variety of midstream infrastructure assets, are expanding capacity to export. So Enterprise is bringing online a significant expansion this year, and they're planning more for next year. Targa, another major exporter, is also adding capacity. There's talk that Energy Transfer is going to export to increase capacity out of their Port Arthur terminal at the same, or Netherlands at Port Arthur. At the same time, they now have much greater capacity to export out of Marcus Hook. So all of these terminals are expanding capacity. At the same time, on the west coast of Canada, AltaGas is not the only company in the export business. Pembina is planning to open up a terminal next year, and that's going to increase exports out of the west coast by another more or less 20,000 barrels a day, right? So Canadians are really looking forward to being able to monetize their propane to a higher degree by reaching the Pacific Basin, right? All the domestic midstreamers are exporting more to anywhere they can, right? I mean, we're now going as far as Indonesia and India, which just 2 years ago were still not being reached. At the same time, just also about Western Canada, there are now 2 propane dehydrogenation plants there that are under construction. Each one of those plants is going to consume about 30,000 barrels a day of propane. So if you add all of that up, actually, if you add the 2 propane dehydrogenation plants, the 2 export terminals, by 2023, 2024, there isn't really going to be that much propane in Western Canada that's still going to need a rail outlet into the south. So south for them is north for us, right? So Michigan, Minnesota, those states.
All right, I've got a question if there aren't others. So Eric, first of all, I think we need to let Warren know that it's 20 degrees and feels like 7. Second of all, I was wondering if he could talk about slide 14 that talked about the delivered propane price. To me, that was interesting to see the slide 13 wholesale price compared to slide 14 delivered propane price, but I'm wondering if he could talk a little bit about like how do they collect that data?
Yeah, I can certainly imagine, which is, I mean, I'll be honest with you, I would have loved to come out, but not only is EIA's travel budget tight, but also, actually I also had some family issues that kept me home. But in a way, I am happy that I don't have to experience those kinds of things. So we actually have a data sharing agreement with all the states that participate. And actually, let me move to a different slide. So what we have here. Okay, so we collect, or actually we don't collect all of these data points. Many of the propane prices and some heating oil prices are collected at the state level by our state energy partners. So whether it's the agricultural department or the consumer affairs department or energy, various states do it in different ways. But for the most part, what we do is we partner with states to collect retail level data. And this data is collected through a telephone survey every Monday. And we have what's called a frame, a list of retailers for every state that are called on a weekly basis. And there is a certain type of question that's being asked. I don't have the details on that. I can certainly share it with maybe I can send it to Kimber and he can forward that to everybody else. Just how that survey looks, what types of questions are being asked. But suffice it to say, this is a phone survey that's performed every week, either by EIA contractors or, generally speaking, by the states themselves. And prices are being asked for propane delivered to the consumer, right? So this includes the full markup between wholesale and retail for the retailer, right? And this year we actually changed the frame a little bit, so the prices are getting a little wacky. You may have noticed that, like, I think it's South or North Dakota has a significant swing in its delivered prices this year. That's because we're still working through some issues, which retailers should be reporting, which ones shouldn't. Some retailers are new, and they're not familiar with the types of questions that we ask. So there's still some kind of growing pains. But for the most part, this is really a phone conversation and that's asking a very particular question. It's the same question to every retailer across the country. So there's consistency in the methodology.
I have 2 questions. The first is, does the decline in propane shipped by rail open up potential rail capacity? Does it mean that the lack of rail cars or number of cars on rail lines will be less of a bottleneck? And I've got a second question after that.
I mean, that's possible to say. What I would tell you is that a lot of this rail capacity was developed with large unit train or semi-unit train shipments in mind, right? So the Cobedale terminal is an excellent example of this. So MarkWest operates significant fractionation capacity at Cobedale, Ohio, that's in the Appalachian Basin in southeastern Ohio. They built out a major, like one of the largest rail terminals to handle hydrocarbon gas liquids in North America. And the purpose of that terminal was not to ship onesies and twosies to retailers in the Upper Peninsula. I'm sorry. The purpose of that terminal was to ship 120 rail car trains to places like Sarnia or Conway that have dedicated loops and injection into storage, right? So a lot of these terminals have tremendous amounts of capacity, but that doesn't change the fact that many of the retailers operate on a 2 to 4 rail car basis at any given time. And those rail cars are delivered by manifest service along with a whole bunch of other stuff. And then they're left on a siding, and it's up to the retailer to discharge propane from those rail cars and bring those rail cars back into cars. So while rail cars will become available and loading capacity will become available, those availabilities may not benefit retailers who don't have the capacity to receive significant volumes at any given time. And that may in fact be what's happening in the Upper Peninsula based on the pricing dynamics that I'm seeing, right? Which is maybe there's not enough on-site storage to bring in, let's say 10, 15 cars, right? So there are places, there are a couple of actually terminals in Minnesota that have been reconfigured that used to be on the Cochin pipeline. They had significant on-site storage capacity. They can now bring in and discharge 6 rail cars at a time, right? So they bring in the rail car, 6 at a time get discharged into significant on-site storage. Those terminals benefit from the fact that they already existed because of the Cochin pipeline that have been repurposed for rail. There are terminals being expanded on the East Coast next to major storage facilities to accommodate greater rail shipments. But unless there is significant on-site storage, whether you have 100,000 or 200,000 rail cars available will make no difference to you.
The other question, and I think you sort of spoke to it, is why is it cheaper to ship propane by rail than the wholesale price at Rapid River, and will the growth of Asian exports change this?
Are there other questions while Eric's typing? Jen got one too? Okay. Oh, Chris has got one too.
If he keeps talking about the UP price, I mean, does he have UP pricing?
Yeah, I was wondering that too.
Because that's
So,
statewide, so
yeah.
maybe more.
Rail shipments are again, prices are, let's say, annual, flat all year long. If it's cheaper to rail propane into Rapid River than the wholesale price, then it means that there is some kind of a bottleneck, right? So Rapid River can supply, again, on average, about 2,000 barrels a day. If prices are above that, the prices are there to incentivize shipments from elsewhere. And if rail shipments or the cost of shipping from Edmonton is below the cost of Edmonton plus to get to Rapid River, then that also means that maybe there isn't sufficient capacity to even ship rail. Now, my understanding is that there's another place, I'm sorry, I'm not from Michigan, I don't know how to pronounce the name of that town. Kenshlo, there you go, thank you. Where there is more storage capacity for propane, but it's possible that Rapid River only has enough storage to basically accommodate the 2,000 barrels that are being recovered from that pipe. And anything above that that's coming in by rail has to basically sit on a siding until it's discharged into a truck. And again, I don't know what's driving that, but that's an excellent question because it suggests to me, like, well, why doesn't somebody just add rail capacity or some storage, right? There may be a reason for that. Maybe because it's a seasonal market and they don't want to add that storage because that storage is going to see activity maybe 2 months of the year. Right? Very difficult to say that, but that's generally the impediment to the development of better retail-oriented propane infrastructure. The fact that the capital expense and the interest payments and all these other costs are annual, but your surge in demand and your premiums only come at certain times of the year. Yes, the state data is presented in the aggregate. My understanding is that There are separate price collections for the Upper Peninsula and for the Lower Peninsula in Michigan. EIA cannot release that data because it's protected by CIPC, which is confidential information. I'm sorry, I don't remember the acronym. Basically what it means is there's the law that protects data submitted to EIA. So EIA is unable to share this information. Michigan, as a participant in the program, also cannot share information at the retailer level. But I know that in the past, some states had separate reporting and collection for different hubs. Like I know that I think in Minnesota, there was collection and reporting for, I think it was Rosemount, that was separate from Mankato, and they reported those two prices separately on their own website. I don't know how it works in Michigan, but I'm quite certain that there are two different hubs, and at both of those hubs there is sufficient market activity that collection from retailers would not reveal a single party's data. But again, EIA does not report that. This is an average Michigan number.
All right, I think we've got a last question from Jen.
Which is looking at the Wisconsin connection, and are there Wisconsin terminals that may help address these bottlenecks that he is aware of? That Alito, was it in particular? But are there Wisconsin points that may address some of these bottlenecks?
Yeah, so Superior in Wisconsin also has a propane or a depropanizer, right? Also on the same line 5. That depropanizer has a reported capacity of 3,000 barrels a day, so slightly larger than Rapid River. There are also refineries in Wisconsin that produce propane. Very difficult to actually say how much of that propane would be available for the Upper Peninsula because Wisconsin has its own market and its own demand, and because of logistical constraints, right? So anything that's now being produced at Superior would have to be trucked into the Upper Peninsula, and I assume that actually a lot of that product probably already is trucked to the Upper Peninsula, right? So it probably already is serving as a source of supply, and I am not sure if there is incremental available capacity. Wisconsin is also at the upper range of these prices. They're kind of in the middle, but generally they hover above the middle. So that suggests to me that Wisconsin already has a balanced market that doesn't have anything to spare, right? So the Mid-America pipeline, for example, comes into Rosemount in Minnesota. From there, a Coke pipeline, I think it's Coke Industries, or maybe it's the Hills. There's a family of companies from a family of people. And that brings it further into the state. But I have little certainty that there is spare capacity to suddenly bring more in, right? So I understand that the question here is about whether, if Rapid River normally receives propane from the Rapid River terminal, could that supply be supplanted from somewhere else? And I'm not sure that that's possible. Also, I also doubt that if Line 5 from Michigan were taken out of commission, that any propane at all would reach the Superior terminal anyway. Because, where does it go from there, right? It has to go further down. That line basically originates outside of Edmonton and goes all the way to Sarnia. Were a stretch of the pipeline taken out of commission, all of the capacity would get available. And in all likelihood, the Superior terminal would also not receive any pipeline out of the province. So in Sarnia, you could also take some propane out, get to Marysville, ship that to the Upper Peninsula. Again, logistical costs involved, and again, lower supply into Sarnia than there used to be in the past. So I think what you could essentially imagine is almost like all the propane kind of going away from the center and going out, right? You've got either Edmonton going out to the Pacific, or you have the Appalachian Basin going out into the Atlantic, All the production in Iraq is going down to the Gulf Coast. So all of the propane kind of leading. And a lot of that is driven not only by the fact that these are premium markets, but also by the fact that these are 365-day-a-year markets, right? And if you're building a pipeline, you want that pipeline to be utilized fully all year long, not sitting there, empty for a half of the year and then running full tilt for the rest half of the year, because that's not the maximization of assets that midstream companies are looking for.
All right, Warren, I think we're all set with questions here, so thank you from all of us. So, yeah, so one more question.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today.
Great. All right, thanks again, Warren. We'll follow up with anything else on email.
Thanks. Enjoy the rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Okay, so, yeah. Appreciation for Warren, which he can't hear. That was a great presentation, and just to give a little context to those of you who haven't been with us for all these sessions, there have been a lot of questions from the task force members to understand propane pricing dynamics, and so that was the desire to bring EIA in. I think there are still certainly gaps in our knowledge, but I think that really took us a long way in the right direction. I hope other folks feel the same way. So, Warren's presentation will be shared. I think you saw a whole lot of hyperlinks in there that I know that David and others are going to read, put into spreadsheets, look up tables, and analyze, and then get back to us, right? So, and then so that'll also be on the website, and then Warren's information is available too for us to follow up with additional questions. So with that, we're going to switch over to a presentation from public sector consultants who we mentioned, oh boy, 3 or 4 sessions ago that we were putting out an RFP for support to the work of the task force. So they're going to present on where they're at and what they've done so far.
I think Eric's going to stand up front.
Sorry, Eric's going to stand up front. Perfect. We look forward to it, Eric.
So
you just set up Eric Pardini?
Yes, I'll do my best to give back some of the time. We ran over a little bit more, but I think really valuable to hear his explanations. And you don't need to hear a lot from me on just a status update. So while we're pulling up the slides, I'll introduce myself. I'm Eric Pardini. I'm a director with Public Sector Consultants. We were hired by the state through a contract with EGLE and Michigan Public Service Commission to support the work of the UP Energy Task Force. My partner, who will be running the slides, Maggie Pallone, Vice President at PSC. We made the drive up from Lansing to visit with the group. So just a brief overview of us. We're a nonpartisan public policy research and consulting firm based in Lansing, Michigan. We've been in operation for 40 years now. We specialize in a couple of different content areas. Maggie and I are with our energy and environment practice. We also do work in health and human services, environment, sorry, I said that one. We also have practice in talent, workforce development, as well as education policy. So we are multidisciplinary. We've worked with a variety of both public and private clients across our 40 years. I've done a lot of work with the state over the years and many large energy providers in the state or other major companies. Our sort of work crosses a lot of different topic areas, as I said, but also we're sort of diverse in the kinds of things that we offer our clients in terms of services. Our work with the UP Energy Task Force is related to evaluating supply alternatives that can be considered related to propane in the state, but we'll also do facilitation of groups. We'll do implementation of projects. We've done a lot of work in sort of natural resource conservation, grant making, et cetera. So we touch a lot of different areas. We're now more than 60 people, and we can go to the next slide. So our project team for this, and our partner is on the phone, so we'll give her a brief moment to introduce herself. But leading the project, Maggie and myself, our director of evaluation, Jill Steiner, and a few other of our sort of key research people, bringing a lot of manpower, person power to this effort. The project runs from September to January, so a lot of work to do in a short period of time, similar to what the task force, their charge has been to come up with some comprehensive recommendations before March 2020. I'm going to introduce Alice just at a high level and allow her to speak. She's on the phone joining us from the DC area. Alice is an independent consultant who brings a lot of national context in both petroleum and propane supply from her work with the Department of Energy and other national organizations. So Alice, can you hear me all right?
I can hear you.
All right, we can hear you okay. So why don't you give an introduction to the task force?
All right, thank you, Eric. Good afternoon, everyone in the room and on the phone. Alice Rupert here. I'm an independent consultant supporting TSC on the current study. I've worked on a number of projects in the state of Michigan. For example, last year I was on the MTU study with respect to Line 5. I previously worked with the Michigan State Police and the Public Service Commission on energy reliability and resilience assessment study. As Eric mentioned, I was employed at the U.S. Department of Energy for many years, where I served as a senior energy advisor and analyst. It was there that I worked with many state and local governments on energy assurance planning, and of course I've worked quite a bit with the industry on energy security and emergency response issues. I became knowledgeable of the propane industry during my tenure at Energy Information Administration, where Lauren currently works. And it's there that I served as the state heating oil and propane project manager, and I sort of learned a lot about propane at that time. And Warren mentioned the state heating oil and propane project, which currently energy offices do survey retailers, wholesalers on their prices. And I believe in the state of Michigan, that's handled through the Public Service Commission. So I have lots of experience dealing with energy disruption events, particularly propane, and that goes as far back as 1989. So with that, I'll stop there and turn it back to you, Eric.
Thanks a lot, Alice. So Alice, we met Alice through recommendations in the scoping of this project. The original proposal, like I said, was I think announced, or request for proposal from the state was announced in August of this year. And the contract formally began in September with, like I said, the final report due for completion in January of 2020. Two main objectives that were identified by the state as part of this request for proposal to support the UP Energy Task Force. So our first goal is to model the existing propane supply and distribution systems based on existing research that assesses the propane supply and distribution system throughout the state with respect to each peninsula by documenting underlying inputs, assumptions, and methodologies. So many of you may be aware there's been a lot of work done over the course of now 5 years to study different impacts of propane related to Line 5 and to other, looking more broadly. The state Michigan Public Service Commission just conducted a really comprehensive effort to inventory and assess the state of all energy supplies within the state, so propane being among them. So there's a lot of existing research that will be combing through and have already begun to comb through as a part of this effort. And with that information, we'll then build out what potential assumptions we can make around how else the state could go about procuring resources. So we'll identify the current state and then look for the alternatives, and many of which you've already heard sort of discussed in this room, looking at different rail or transportation options that could potentially help the state with its propane supplies. The next step of our, go back one more, the next objective relates to the approaches that could potentially be used. And so part of the report that the task force is scheduled to give to the governor is what are those supply alternatives. So we will be, after developing the model for the existing supply scenarios, we will be coming up with the best case options to consider in the event that that configuration has to change. So we will evaluate those based on a few different parameters, but primarily looking to optimize based on reliability, cost, and emergency preparedness. The task force will have an opportunity prior to the January 31st to review some interim findings from our report, and we will make public the report through a presentation to the task force as the project wraps up. So our approach really follows those main objectives in 3 phases. So we are currently sort of in the first phase, looking to complete that, moving into phase 2. We are starting, like I said, with an analysis of existing studies and information that's been done. We are augmenting that research with direct engagement and interviews with industry participants from around the propane industry and energy industry more broadly. So we are talking to a lot of the major players. So these are the pipeline operators, these are the storage owners, the retailers, the wholesalers, really trying to get a grasp of every single aspect of this industry and to define as much information as we can that either to validate what's already been in the public space or to gain additional information. As we wrap that up, we'll be putting together our list of assumptions to be used in evaluating alternatives. That'll roll into the actual identification of what alternatives may be, and then the modeling to determine what the impacts of different scenarios is. Finally, the public-facing report, a presentation, and presenting to the UP Energy Task Force. I think that does it for us, so we have some time for questions if Task Force has, but we are available as a resource through the team at Eagle and the MPSC throughout this process, but we'll be reporting out on sort of specific deliverables probably in the next month. So,
any questions for Eric from Task Force members? It's a quiet crowd. I don't know what that means. Eric's off the hook.
I'll take it.
Okay, great. Thank you, Eric and Maggie. Good luck. Appreciate it. Okay, that does get us a little bit closer back to on schedule. So with that, Kimber, I'm going to look at you and see if we have cards for public comment. 2 cards for public comment. Great. Thank you, ma'am. So if anybody else is interested in giving public comment today, look for Kimber. There's cards in the back. We'd love to have you. No, go ahead, please. Sorry, I was just filling in time while the microphone came to the front. Okay, so with that, I'd like to invite Richard Smith up to the microphone, please. Is Richard here? Oh, thank you. Welcome, Richard.
Yes, thank you.
Oh, you have paper for us, too. Thank you so much.
There's probably more than I come to bring your attention to perhaps an alternative energy that is not an immediate concern, but perhaps would be something that we in the UP might, or Michigan as a whole, might want to look at somewhere in the next 5 to 10 years, perhaps. The alternative energy is called molten salt reactor. There's many types of different reactor designs, but this one, from what I've read and studied over the last 1.5 years, seems to have, in my opinion, the greatest promise. And you combine that with the use of thorium as a fuel, I think you have the best option in terms of the most energy produced, the safest way, lowest cost, least amount of waste, and the amount of thorium that is available is reported to be something that would take the Earth perhaps hundreds of thousands of years to use. So, for the UP, we could probably get by with one small plant if and when we ever wanted it, perhaps 2 or 3, maybe 4, one in the Sioux, one in Marquette, one in the Escanaba area, maybe another in Ironwood. And this is baseload energy. Doesn't require the sun to shine, doesn't require the wind to blow. It's constant. In terms of the power that's available with this energy, let's say also to illustrate the small amount of waste that would be produced. If you had a 1,000 megawatt plant, it would require about 1 ton of thorium, 2,000 pounds. that would take that plant approximately 1 year to use that thorium. At the end of that 1 year, you would have approximately 340 pounds of waste out of that original 2,000 pounds. That 340 pounds of waste would be something that would be controlled and would have to be kept under control for approximately 300 years. And that seems like a long time, but you compare that to today's waste from nuclear power plants, it's a fraction of the time. So, for what it's worth, one last thing, as a way of example, if you could put all the energy that you might need as an individual into one place at one time, for all the energy that you'd need for your entire life, the amount of thorium that would be needed to accomplish that would be about this amount. So there isn't anything else that will provide that density of an energy production.
Great.
And if we can produce our electricity for 3 cents per kilowatt hour, I think we could become an economic magnet.
Great.
Thank you for
Thank
what
you,
it's worth.
Richard. Appreciate that.
Yep.
Okay, and everyone has handouts from Richard as well. Next, I'd like to invite up Mary Pelton Cooper, please, from Nagani. Thank you, Mary.
So I have lived up here for 40 years, and I have really appreciated the strength of the Upper Peninsula people. I think that we can overcome the kinds of problems that we're dealing with right now. I also really appreciate the amount of information that you all have had to digest. It is certainly a very complicated system, but that doesn't mean, the fact that it is so intricate and complicated doesn't mean that we can't move beyond it. I do not feel like the boards of commissioners represented us well at all. Certainly when you look at what happened in Traverse City, you find that they voted for something when to support the tunnel idea, when they had people lined up outside demonstrating against it, and most of the people who spoke did not want it. The tunnel is a very reckless idea. I know that people feel like it makes sense because Enbridge says it makes sense. And that it will be some sort of an essential corridor, but I don't think it's safe at all. I don't think they have demonstrated that. I have not seen it. And Nestle's office does not feel that they have demonstrated that it will not create additional problems for us. We need protection from Enbridge. They have failed us. They are not reliable. What they did in the Kalamazoo River is still completely unforgivable, and they have not explained how that's not going to happen again. So that is, I mean, this is not actually about propane. This whole thing was generated by the severe problem that we have with Enbridge being an unreliable provider of critical needs for us. So please, remember that we are all individual consumers, that we are all at risk. 700 miles of shoreline are at risk, and we are stewards of that, all of that. We have to protect it. So please don't forget that when you write the final report. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Mary. Okay, and next I'm going to invite up Joe Kaplan from Escanaba. Joe, if you'd like to come to the microphone. And again, I'm just going to say I got a couple more cards while Joe's coming up. If anyone else is interested in speaking, oh yeah, Kimber's got another one coming, so feel free to reach out to Kimber. Great, thanks.
Hi, thanks for having me. Great to see this group make the big trip up to Escanaba. And I just want to talk about solar. In July 3rd, my wife and I hooked into a grid-tied system in Escanaba. Our utility is not state regulated, and I was able to work with our electrical manager to do a grid-tied system. We're not exactly haven't worked out the details of what to do with our excess credit, but I can tell you, since we threw the switch on July 3rd, we are basically paying for the utility meter, and that's it. I cannot believe what an incredible source of energy that those panels have provided. It's a 4.6K system, and I couldn't be more tickled about it, except as I get more and more enthusiastic about solar, I get more and more concerned about the direction that solar is going in our state, and primarily two things. One is my ability to do grid-tied solar could change at any moment, depending on the, I guess, what our city feels. And I know that outside of Escanaba, I would not have been able to do this grid-tied system. I would have been forced to do, work with Upper Peninsula Power Company, which charges some of the highest rates in the country for electricity. And they were the first state-regulated utility that maxed out on the type of system that I put in, where we use the grid as basically our solar bank. I'm sure you're all familiar. So my concern is, I had a neighbor who, or not a neighbor, but someone who lived outside of Escanaba, who was, I guess, inspired by what we did in his system. Unfortunately, he puts it in at 7 cents a kilowatt hour and has to buy it back at 25. So for every kilowatt hour that he produces, he loses 14 cents. So my rate of return on my investment is about 8 years. His is about 45, and he's in his 60s. So he's just doing it for the good of the service, but UPCO is the only one benefiting from what he's done. The second one is how solar is going to manifest on our landscape up here. We have, it's basically wind and solar, unregulated energy utilities. They don't come under any federal regulatory control. So my other job is as a research biologist. I study migratory water birds, especially common loon populations, which in our region have declined at our monitored sites 40%. We blame that on botulism, but I think if we get the kind of solar, the scope of the solar that's been proposed, even in this county, 400,000 panels, we're going to be picking up loons off of the ground as they do out in California. So I would love to see some sort of regulation that recognizes migratory birds as important, because there are impacts of migratory birds to both industrial scale solar and industrial scale wind, and the Fish and Wildlife Service is behind the mark on that, because there is nothing at the federal level that allows that regulation to protect those birds. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Joe.
Quick 3 minutes.
Yep, appreciate that. 3 minutes goes fast.
It
All right.
sure does.
Next, I'm going to invite up Rosemary Greer.
I am from the Houghton Hancock area, actually in the boondocks of Houghton Hancock, so I'm one of those very rural users of propane. And we've been using propane for 30 years that we've lived there, and we have there are a number of propane users in our area. And we chose propane because it was a clean energy. We used to burn wood. Our son had some a bit of asthma, so when he was younger, we had to stop using wood, because even with the best system, unless it's outside burner, it just, the little bit of smoke that comes back through was bothering him. So we've been very pleased with our propane supplier. My biggest concern about all of this is the fact that my propane, along with everybody else in the UP, comes from a single source. And that is not at all reassuring to me for obvious reasons, because it heats our house, it cooks our food, and it heats our water. So I know the task force is looking at all kinds of sources for our energy supply. So I'd like to encourage you to continue to do that, because we do need to rely on many different types. And I really do think solar is one of those, like Joe just mentioned, solar is an up-and-coming energy that's going to probably serve people, and not necessarily an 800-acre solar farm. Along with that, the ability for individuals to have their own solar panel and have their own energy safety and reassurance. So that would also be a consideration I would like the task force to continue to look at. And I am very impressed now. This is my second task force meeting when you came to the Houghton Hancock area in September. I was just on the beginning, on the fringe of starting to understand this complicated system of what you're trying to do. And in the meantime, I've done a lot of research on my own to try to find out what are the facts here, what information is true and what isn't true. Even from reliable sources, I read conflicting information, from our political leaders to different groups. So what I'm encouraged about with the task force is that you are looking at all resources here from all walks of industry and organizations and people. So I feel reassured that you probably are the best represented group here to bring to the UP and hopefully to the rest of Michigan energy that would be diversified, also environmentally responsible at the same time. So thank you very much, and I'm really interested in knowing about the report that will be coming up with the two people who came, the public service. So I'd like to be able to read that right away too as soon as it comes out. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Rosemary. All right, I'd like to invite up, is it Linda Bullison?
Burleson.
Thank you.
With a R.
I apologize.
That's all right.
Thanks for fixing it. Welcome, Linda.
I'm also from the boondocks of Houghton, southern Houghton. And this is my second visit with your panel too. I saw you when you were in Hancock. And I think I just get more confused. It's such a complex issue. Who knew it was going to be this hard to keep us warm? But I want to just thank this panel and the governor for putting together this panel. I think it's so important to make it a public kind of thing with thought and educating oneself into this complex issue. And I would hope that somewhere along the line, and that kind of echoes maybe what Joe was talking about in Rosemary, that our way we deliver energy to people can be more community-based and more community-controlled. And I think that it would be safer. Large grids can be hacked into, and the whole thing can go down. More community-based. I think there's more safety in that kind of delivery system, and so I too will be interested in following what you do and looking at the final report, and thank everyone for their time and effort.
Great, thank you, Linda. Okay, and I'm just going to make one more pitch. If anyone wants to speak, feel free to see Kimber and grab a card. We're coming to the last card. We also are interested in additional public input throughout the course of this process, so you can certainly submit things in writing if you prefer not to do it publicly. With that, Michelle Dietrich. I'd like to invite Michelle up from Superior Township. Hi, Michelle.
Hi there. Yeah, my name is Michelle Dietrich, and I'm from Superior Township, which is down in Washtenaw County. I'm also the National Chairwoman of the DNC Council on Climate and Environment. And I'm a former county commissioner, and as a former county commissioner who founded our Climate Council and sits on it still, I want to thank you for doing this very hard and complicated and necessary work. The devil and the angel are in the details, and you're delving into it in a wonderful, open and transparent way. As I'm aware, and you are too, hearings like this are happening all over America. And it's the cumulative result of the work that you're doing in all of these hearings, people like you, and people like you too, because you are what democracy looks like. Thank you so much for being here. That is going to determine whether or not we're going to be able to move away from greenhouse gas emissions at the rate that we need to. We know from the recent science that the climate change is happening faster than even the scientists thought, than the models predicted. So my experience sitting in chairs like yours is it's really easy to lose that sense of urgency because the details are also important. But I'm just asking that you please remember that and please move toward the renewable sources as quickly as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. All right, final card. I managed to break one free. Kim Wyckoff. Kim, I'd like to invite you up to the microphone. Welcome, Kim.
Thank you. I was just handed this as I was
shortly before I came up to read. So this is with regard to the solar project that they are proposing in the Escanaba Township area. There's research at the University of Michigan shows that solar installations are supported by the community when the community is involved in the development of the project. There's a great example of that here in our own area. There was a solar project that was being proposed at the old KRCR Air Base with community support. But from day one, the community was involved in developing that project. In our own area, in the Escanaba Township area, there has been a solar project that has been being worked on for 2 years now. But it was under the table, it was without the involvement of the community. It was adjoining landowners not knowing that there was going to be over 445,000 solar panels put up in our community. We found out about this in about June, and they've been working on it for about 1.5 years at that point. Orion, which is the company who is proposing this, has been involved in creating the solar ordinance in our community with regard to setbacks, the vegetation barriers, lighting, the total acreage, the legacy, and the cleanup, and saying that our community benefits. However, the community was not involved in it. Currently, the draft ordinance designed by Orion for Orion has setbacks from the center of the house, not the property line, which is not a standard practice. There has been an ad hoc committee that has been designed in order to be on a fact-finding mission. However, the people involved in that ad hoc community, or that committee, is Orion themselves, UPCO, and some of the landowners that will be leasing their land for this property, for the solar project. We have a local groundwater specialist that lives in the Escanaba Township area that they didn't even put on the ad hoc committee. So we're concerned as to what fact-finding do they really want to do, because they obviously don't want to hear from our own local experts. And so if anybody, will be here, we'd be more than welcome. We'd like some input on this because we need to come up with some kind of a resolution. This has torn our community apart. Families have lived in this area for years and years and years, and it has completely torn our community apart. And we need to come to some kind of a resolution.
Thanks, Kim. All right, and we've got one more. Randy Scott from, is it Bark River? Randy?
Yes, ma'am.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. My name is Randy Scott. I'm a consulting engineer, work for municipalities from Ironwood to Sault Ste. Marie. So I travel the peninsula all the time, and I have the opinions of the people from Ironwood to Sault Ste. Marie on this issue. I am the city engineer for the city of St. Ignace, so I'm very familiar with the Straits and the Straits area and the issues and what the people think over there. I live here, and I'm on propane. And I've been very concerned about a few things that have developed in the last few years that come back and haunt me all the time. I was not on propane. I lived in Escanaba Township, which the young lady was just speaking about a minute ago, when the gas crisis hit up here back 13, 14. I hear a lot of talk about pricing, but I don't hear any commentary about the people that couldn't get their tanks filled because the shortage got so bad, they wouldn't allocate more than maybe 50 gallons per fill-up. And as the winter stretches on and gets longer and longer and longer, I know quite a few people that were getting very concerned about maybe having to pull the shingles off the house and start burning them. So there's that component of it. I'm also a civil engineer. I do not have the fear of the tunnel under the Straits. I've seen these projects, been around these types of projects over the years, and I think it's a very positive asset for the state to have some kind of backup connection between St. Ignace and Mackinac City. I've worked with Mackinac Island. I know the people out there, talked to them quite a bit about this in the past. And I just want the other thing that bothers me is the power issue that occurred when Wisconsin's Public Service Commission a number of years ago decided that they would go to FERC and make some complaints about the pricing structure that was going between Michigan and Wisconsin at the time, tying in the Presque Isle power plant. All these things are supply-related issues coming from our neighbor to the south that deeply concern me. I also sit on the Delta County Planning Commission. So when Joe was up here speaking a little bit ago, he knows he sat in front of me for a number of months ago, years, having to do with the windmills and garden. The young lady from Escanaba Township, I've been to those meetings. It's torn the community apart. The garden windmills tore the community apart. They're not so easy. And when you're sitting on that side of the table, trying to make those decisions in front of these people, I mean, we were sitting with meeting after meeting of packed houses, 3 hours long. It's not so easy. It's not such an easy, publicly accepted issue, is all I'm saying. And I know your beeper's going to go off, so I'm going to cut myself short. And thank you.
Right.
Believe me, I sat with the 3-minute from the other side of the table for 3 years. So I thank you all for visiting Escanaba, and drive safely going home.
Thank you, Randy. Do we have anybody else that's interested? Kimber says yes? No, we're good? Anybody else? Okay. All right, we're going to end public comment right now. It's 2:30. Please feel free to, catch Kimber, though. We can probably squeeze a few more in if we need to. So we're going to switch to the next topic on our agenda, which is an internal working session of the task force. So I'm going to say, first of all, thank you. Really appreciate everyone that does participate in these meetings and share public comment with us. And then before we go too far with the internal working session, I do think it's important just to kind of rehash our mission, to be clear. So, we don't sit here and respond to all the input that we receive from public comment, but just broadly, I want to articulate for our audience, the task force members, first of all, over majority from the UP. We have, I think, 12 Upers and 9 trolls. Sadly, I'm a troll, but I'm a wannabe. And so I think that's a good representation. I also appreciate the comments that, this is a diverse group that sits up here. So I appreciate everyone's time participating in the task force. I also wanted to share, just to kind of reiterate for all, we've been tasked from an executive order, so feel free to take a look at that executive order. Those in our audience who might not have, it's on the website as well. 2019-14. So we were tasked with assessing the UP's overall energy needs and how they're currently being met. We've been tasked with formulating alternative solutions for UP energy needs, focusing on security, reliability, affordability, and environmental soundness. Finally, identifying and evaluating potential changes that could occur to energy supply and distribution in the UP, consider economic, environmental, and other impacts of such change, and the alternatives for meeting the UP energy needs. The short-term deliverable, I say short-term because it's feeling pretty short right now, of March 2020 is a report specifically on what might happen with a propane supply disruption. The longer-term deliverable of March 2021 will allow the task force to step back and look overall at the Upper Peninsula and all energy resources. So just want to, kind of create that boundary again that I know everyone here on the task force is very familiar with, but I think it kind of helps articulate what's in front of us. So with that, again, this is the 5th meeting of the task force. We've had a lot of different pieces of presentation, and so for those of you who are joining us today who may not have looked at our previous presentations or participated previously, it might feel a little disjointed, but this team's been getting together pretty regularly over the last few months. And so I hope task force members that you felt like the presentations that we queued up were responsive to your comments over the last couple of sessions, because that's what we tried to do, is understand what kind of discussion points and additional information was necessary to support the work of the task force. So you heard the presentation from public sector, and we've talked sort of broadly about taking us into this more deliberative phase, and that would of course be part of the December 10th session as well, to use what we've seen as a groundwork that's been laid, and then think about are there recommendations that this task force feels comfortable putting forth to the governor in that March report. Phew, I think that's most of the setup. Did I miss anything? Mr. Vice Chair, anybody else? No, okay. So with that, I am interested in comments, reactions to the presentations that we heard today, illumination that, you might be interested in discussing, so that we can also think about if there's additional information that's necessary to get in front of the task force. So I'm going to stop talking for a minute.
I'd like to say something.
Please.
We toured the Rapid River propination plant this morning, and one of the things that came out of that was the differential between supply and demand through that plant. And I'm just wondering, and the EAA guy, Warren, had mentioned that there's probably a bottleneck somewhere regarding that. Is there a possibility of taking a look at what it would require to expand that facility to meet or increase the reliability of the propane delivery to the UP?
So, I mean, it's a private facility, right? And so I think, we heard from Plains in Hancock, and we heard from Enbridge in Hancock, because it's a kind of a dually constructed facility. And off the top of my head, my general inclination would be like the economics have to work, right? The economics don't work to encourage additional supply. We saw the 4 tanks, or storage, we saw the 4 tanks. The other step is policy levers, right? So are there reasons, from a policy perspective, that, this task force might recommend that, the state do whatever might be in its power to suggest additional, storage somewhere across the state? I mean, that would be one step, right? We've talked a lot about rail. We've communicated. You see rail reflected in a lot of these presentations, and so we've reached out to CN. They're interested in anticipating. We just couldn't make things work out for today. And I think did they have materials? No, not yet. I'm looking at James. Okay, so they were going to try to also get materials to the task force about like what does the rail side look like, and then of course, there's also the trucking side of it. So I mean, as you guys all know, through the course of these presentations, it's a pretty complicated soup of what ends up encouraging that additional storage build out. But it's probably some combination of if the economics don't work, then there's got to be a policy lever. And so again, that's why we had the Attorney General's office speak last time and then this time about like what are the policy levers they've been thinking about, because we heard from this team, this task force, that you all were interested in understanding some of what exists in statute and how that might be used in a way to encourage potential different outcomes.
Thank you.
I don't know that that was a very clear answer.
Complicated issue.
It is.
And the other part, building on that, is in the Sioux, we heard about the complicated mix of making sure that people's homes stay heated, and how there are literally millions of dollars flowing federally from the federal government and the state into people's homes right now on a mostly emergency basis. And so our system is also propped up. I don't know, there's maybe a better way to say that, but people wouldn't stay warm in the UP without the dollars flowing in from the government. So there's something else, and I'm not sure that, and that's sort of beyond propane, and even that's wood and propane. We're paying for people to get wood into their homes, not just propane in that system. So I think there's that bigger question that's going to come at us in 2020. But it's so clear to me that we have this limited supply, like you said, in Rapid River, and we've heard, when we heard from the folks in Hancock, it's coming in by truck from Wisconsin. If folks go down to Wisconsin and get it, folks go down to downstate and go get it. It's coming in by rail from Ontario through the Sioux. It's being brought into us in a variety of ways, the number one way being at Rapid River. And yeah, I would sort of, and so one thing that came up in Hancock to address that is what if we gave people 1,000-gallon tanks instead of 500-gallon tanks? Because then the storage is sitting in the people's homes. And because the emergency trigger is 25%, then they'd have more in their tank when they hit the emergency level. And exploring what that idea looks like. That does seem to be something that has come up, but is as a possible alternative, and really fleshing that out and understanding what that would look like.
Thanks, Jen. Yep.
Just in noticing or looking at the slides that Warren presented, and particularly the one that showed all of the Midwest states, and I know Chris tried to get it broken out between UP and Michigan, or Lower Michigan, but for every period described, Michigan's was a couple of cents or 15, 20 cents higher than all of the rest of the Midwest states, and I'm hopeful that public sector consultants, when they complete their work, can outline for us what makes Michigan the most expensive state in the Midwest, when we have a pipeline running through that delivers propane, not just to Rapid River, but to Marysville and Sarnia, and why does Michigan pay not only the highest electric rates, but why are our propane costs marginally higher than the rest of the Midwest states? And so that got me curious as to what function of the whole system makes Michigan stand out, not just last year or the year before, but for the 5 or 6 years that the data is there, we're on top of every year's information.
Yeah, I will say that stood out to me too, and one of the things I wondered is if, in some of Warren's conversation, he mentioned the challenges of deliverability, and so I don't know if there's just something consistent about, what it takes to make sure that we're reaching our entire population, if that's a component. I don't know. It's an interesting question.
And to Jen's point about the storage at people's homes rather than having the retailers or the single wholesaler that we have in the UP responsible for storing an adequate supply. And maybe that's something Chris, as a third generation propane retailer, Fifth. Oh, my bad.
You were close.
I know it goes back a long ways. The capital cost for a business like yours and the other retail propane suppliers in the UP, the capital for you to increase your storage capacity to enable you to get enough in the lower usage months to supply when the need is the greatest, starting in October, November. Is that prohibitive? Would that capital cost be prohibitive? And I don't know if you're prepared to answer that just as a single retailer, but does it make more sense to have the ability for your customer base to have a bigger tank in their yard rather than you putting a bigger or several more bullets in your facility?
And I wouldn't speak for all retailers, but as our business, being, going on 101 years, we started in 1918, so I would feel as though we have a lot of experience, and yes, before the polar vortex, and then therefore after, we increased our storage, not the consumer storage, because generally their storage based upon their usage, it was easier for us to encompass that cost and our own storage and have larger tanks in the customer's yard. It would just, business-wise and cost-wise, it make more sense. But yes, we have increased, dramatically. And we are very diverse. We get truck and rail.
Mm-hmm.
Please, Michael.
I really appreciated some of Warren's comments and his presentation, kind of for that very large picture of propane pricing and how it came forward. Early on in one of our first meetings, we presented with a variety of pricing potential pricing and how much it would cost to bring in by truck or rail, but I think that also had a number of, they supposed that, the propane would find a way, or the liquids would find a way down to Sarnia, and that also suggests that Superior would remain open. And kind of what Warren was kind of suggesting is that if Line 5 went away, that Superior, there may not be a reason for Superior to stay open. And so I think that would call upon some of the assumptions that were made in those earlier reports to us that suppose that Superior would remain open. And so I think when public sector continues to kind of look forward, kind of taking that into consideration, if Line 5 were to go away and Superior were no longer an option, what would that actually look like? Because I would suppose you'd see more than a 12-cent to 28-cent kind of increase, as was suggested in some of those earlier reports.
It's a good point, Michael. I had the same thought. Robin?
A couple of questions, and the first one is to...
Can you talk into the mic, sorry, Roman, so we can get people on the phone here.
All right, I'm not going to be yelling now. Sort of to build on Chris's point about the retail price information about the UP. I know we've touched upon that several times, but unless I missed something, we still don't know what the breakdown between the Lower Peninsula and the Upper Peninsula is, right? So, and I don't know where to get this data, whether we have this data, the state has this data, or it will require a survey for this year. So that's the first thing. And if possible, if it is a survey data that is collected, you can identify individual retailers or individual distributors. It would be also good to see the spread among those distributors. So that's my first thought. And the second thought is about the analysis upon which public service consultants are about to embark. And that is, Randy Scott's comment got me thinking about it. And when we are talking about a sudden disruption in supply, we tend to focus on averages, right? So average price goes up, average, I don't know, consumer suffers by this much, but the way, it's my understanding, propane is distributed, right? So you will run into a situation when you have people whose supply, individual supply is very low, and for either the lack of availability of the resource, i.e. propane, or the price that is unaffordable, these people are not capable of replenishing their tank. So it would be great to see the impact, if there is any way to model impact of such catastrophic disruption in supply on individual households, to approximately see how many households do we foresee having no propane whatsoever, and what that actually means in terms of potential property damage, those kind of things. What are the actual consequences of that supply?
So I think we have a little bit of data that we can pull together from Rupert's presentation around what our number of low-income residents in the Upper Peninsula are reliant on propane. I remember we heard from her that we had some folks that were even doing whole house heating on electricity because they wouldn't be shut off, if you recall that conversation. So I think we can pull some of that data together and try to get in the direction of where you're going. I don't know if we can go all the way, but I think there's some data there.
And I think there is a way to model, actually, because we can probably even see like how many, what's the, how many, for example, households on average would have a low level of propane, right? So on a given day. I mean, we can estimate that, and I think there is a way to model that too, not just from the price standpoint, but purely from the availability standpoint. So.
Yeah, so on the data on between the UP and the Lower Peninsula, it's complicated. All of this is complicated. The EIA typically gets their data from the Public Service Commission, which does regular surveys, and we have that data. Warren talked to the confidentiality of that information, and so I can't speak to the specifics on because of the sample sizes between the Upper Peninsula and the Lower Peninsula. And so I will say that the data up there probably looks a little different for every state based on the retailers that participate in the sampling. And they're not huge sample sizes, so small differences in who participates or doesn't between states can drive differences in how states appear in connection to each other. I haven't said anything that gets me in trouble yet, have I? Okay, excellent. I think we are also trying to get a different non-confidential data set, or at least a data set that we can use and share that may have comparisons, and that's being done by the public sector consultants team. So I think we're in some ways trying to replicate the stuff that we have without the confidentiality issues that make it difficult to share differences. Okay. Good.
Madam Chair, will you be emailing the presentation from EIA and
Absolutely.
Public sector as well?
So we'll be emailing for task force members, and then everyone who's here and interested, anyone who's not here and interested, it'll all be posted on the website too.
Okay.
Not only the presentations, but also the recording of this conversation.
Thank you.
Yep. Great point, Tony. Thank you.
So, sorry about this cold. Roman brought up at lunch, so I'll give credit to Roman. We're talking about propane, but we're talking about heating and just heating our homes. And to go back to this, that our system that we currently have is actually dependent on bringing in a couple of $1 million a year to make sure that people's homes are heated. That people literally would not be warm, could not heat their homes unless we did that. And so, and the thing about propane is that it works, and it's fairly easy to move around. But it does, to me, it's such a, we're hearing again constraint after constraint after constraint, because as was also made clear in Hancock, if all the propane would go to be making plastic somewhere else, not here, like it has a higher value as a plastic than it does as a heating agent, because it's not 365, and because people aren't, you can drive the price up when it's built into something where you can then sell it later, as opposed to a consumable. I think that's what we're learning. So that begs the question to me of what are the alternatives to heating besides propane? And that having money, so maybe in the recommendations there are proposals for pilot projects to demonstrate, to learn from what are other northern communities doing around the country, to find other ways to make sure that people's homes are heated, food is cooked, and water is heated in ways that we're not using as the source energy, something that wants to be, for better or for worse, made into plastic somewhere else.
Yep, I think that makes sense, and I also think that bridges the two reports, and we'll have to figure out how to think about alternatives in the short term that also feeds into the kind of second phase of the report. Do we have input at all from Mike Douglas or Tanya on the phone? Just want to make sure we've given you guys a chance to jump in if you're interested.
This is Douglas, thank you. I just want to make one point about the discussion of assuring supply at the customer level. Larger tanks are not necessarily the right solution, and certainly not the only one. The reorder points are important. And I know that the industry practice is 25%. that is aided by the change in heating of systems that we made a few years ago. But the importance of that reorder point changes seasonally. And I do think that a very systematic study of what's the right set of policies around when tanks get refilled is something that should be a part of this.
Great, thanks Douglas.
I don't have anything.
I don't have anything to add, thanks. Okay, Mike, Tanya, it sounded like you're both participating and listening but didn't have anything to add.
You got it.
Great, Dan?
So, a couple things that I think come out of today's presentations, and I'll include a number of us, as you heard, went to go see the Rapid River Terminal earlier, as well as sort of stuff building. The first is, I come back to that I am increasingly convinced, I mean I was when I started, or else I wouldn't have joined, but of the importance of the work of what we're doing here. I do think that if you want to look at what it would look like if we didn't have Line 5 plus Rapid River, I think we've got a pretty good sense of that. It probably looks a lot like what it looked like before 1996 when it opened, or what other states look like today, and that's basically more storage and more rail, and more trucking as well, but largely more storage, more rail. And so I think, there's Line 5 and Rapid River have obviously played a role, but the disruptions to the status quo, I think, could take a number of different forms. So there's a lot of talk about the tunnel, and I think the tunnel likely solves for safety issues in the straits. It's hard for me to at least see the straits being impacted if the tunnel ultimately runs through, or if the line runs through a tunnel. But I'm not sure that the tunnel solves for other disruptions, failures upstream or downstream of that, where if Line 5 or Line 1, that is the only feed source of Line 5 that connects in Superior, if those were disrupted in the way that the Kalamazoo line was, what that means. And so I think it is good, even given the status quo and regardless of the feelings on the tunnel, that we're doing this work. So I'll say that as the first one. But also, increasingly, I think we're seeing disruptions that have nothing to do with any of that and where we have no control. So this growth in the export markets and the fact that basically everything Warren said today was that we had this glut of propane in the Midwest, Conway, Superior, and over a number of years we've seen pipelines like Cochin repurposed, and now we've seen this sort of from the Midwest going out to the export markets, whether it's the Gulf Coast or Maryland or British Columbia, and sort of greater price parity between some of these far-flung places and what the Midwest price is. I mean, I think that's an issue that forces us to think about these sort of huge macroeconomic issues that we have no control over as we're trying to develop solutions for the UP. So I guess that's the first. The second is that it was interesting to me to hear Warren talk about rail and storage as bottlenecks, and that currently it's cheaper to take the Edmonton price, though that's going up because of export markets, plus transportation, and that's typically cheaper than the wholesale price in Michigan. To me, that says, again, rail and storage is part of the solution here potentially, and also the greater competition at the wholesale level can play a role. And one of the things we learned today was that the Kinchlow terminal, which Plains had operated for a number of years, was recently sold to a non-affiliated entity, and that, I think, plus the availability, I know, Chris, you take some rail offloading from a different wholesaler, and others with that capacity do as well. But that, I think, can help to increase wholesale competition that may have a positive impact on prices. And I feel like those two are the real things, that there's going to be disruptions that we can, I guess, think about and maybe anticipate, but there are a whole lot more that we don't necessarily have as much control over. And we need to be prepared for those too in order to make sure that UP residents can keep the heat on. And that there are a series of solution sets that are pretty limited. It's other transportation options, additional storage, that, that can be included in what we think will happen. But I guess the final point I'd make is that as we think about the plans, and whether they're short-term plans, long-term plans, immediate disruption plans, planned disruption plans, there's this market, I think, limits. I think we can say what we think will happen, but our ability to control what will happen in a largely unregulated, as far as price and availability market goes, is really, really limited. And so, that may, for somebody like me that's a regulator, that I like to be able to touch and control things. That's hard to get my head around, but it may also just be the way it is, and that to say we can guarantee you is probably not a guarantee that this body's ever going to be able to make. But based on our study of what the system looks like, we think these things would happen if these sources or these disruptions were to occur. I think we can probably make that with some degree of confidence, given the situation as we see it, knowing that it's likely to change over time as well.
Any thoughts on what Dan shared?
I'd like to say, Dan, that's the best thing I've heard since I've sat on this committee. Thank you.
Nice.
So hear from Chris. And I'll second Chris. David, were you trying to get in on there? No?
I just have a thought here that I will throw out there. We just did a solar customer last week between snowstorms there on a roof, and thank you, Tanya, for that client. But anyway, they're on propane, and then Warren mentioned that there's competition from air source heat pumps in there. So what I'm doing with my business, or what I'm going to do with my business and my home, I'm on propane on my home, and I'm on natural gas on my business, but I'm going to put the air source heat pumps in there, and I want to see, how low we can get our propane use, basically, with using that alternative air source heat pump. They're simple to put in and stuff like that. And the other thing we could do is, I know it's an unregulated market, but energy efficiency. I mean, the customer we did with solar air is pumping half his propane 500-gallon tank out his ridge vent. He has no insulation in his attic, nothing. He's just pumping it out. He's not air after that. There is so much opportunity on the energy efficiency side for propane and natural gas. But most of the propane guys are rural, so there's a very large opportunity if we can figure out how to logistically pull it off with Superior Watershed or whatever vehicle the state would need to execute one of those programs. But it just would cut your propane use dramatically in the rural sector. It just bugs me because that's what we do with my business, and I'd really like to see a program where we can start attacking some of these clients from the propane industry and reduce their use.
Yeah,
I agree with that, and the Superior Watershed Partnerships, we've been doing home energy assessments for a while. I have the energy conservation class here today in the audience. We're going to be doing 500 home energy scores. That is funded through the Michigan Energy Systems Program. And we're going to be able to basically look at the home and give it a rate of 1 to 10 based on other homes similar, and let that homeowner know what they can do to reduce those costs. And, we'll be able to do a little bit of weatherization for 50 of the homes. But, we would love to be able to get more funding too, so that we could also do more weatherization. As far as I know, the only agency that has money for that is Community Action Agency. And they, from what the gentleman in St. Ignace told us, he could do about $20,000 in one home for up to 30 homes in his county. So as far as I know, there's no competition. All the money is given to Community Action Agency at this time. So I don't really know what it is county-wise, how many homes are being served that way, but I think Dave's right. If we could reduce the consumption in these homes, we could reduce the need for energy assistance as well.
Appreciate that, Tanya. I think that what I'm hearing from everybody's comments is threads of what you all bring to the table and threads of what we've seen in the presentations over the last 5 meetings, which I think is a good sign. I think it's a good sign that we have had a lot of the right conversations that now we need to tie together and bring back to all of you for feedback and synthesis. Yeah, please,
I'm moving
Tony.
my closer. Commissioner Scripps, I don't want to, but I respectfully disagree with you a little bit on what you said.
I'm glad you do.
Well, you said what we'll look like if, I think you said if line 5 goes away, we'll look like what we look like in 1996. Is that correct?
Yeah.
I think the disagreement comes with me with taxes here in the UP that Enbridge and others pay and line the utility companies that serve line 5 and others. I think the jobs that were created because of line 5 and other pipelines and the installation and maintenance of it certainly wouldn't look like it did pre-1996. And so I think, and that's part of what I wanted to ask public sector, and I hope they have those considerations in their report back to us at some point in time, because part of our task is to look at the economic effects of what could happen, not just with different propane delivery. More trucks on the road, that means there is some jobs that the net loss of jobs might not be as much as we would think it would be, but I think we want to consider that. So I don't think that we would look like pre-1996. I think that there would be some huge considerations that we'd have to look at. Being the UP in the state of Michigan, there's 3 utility companies, and our largest customer is Enbridge from what we heard in the past.
Yes, no, I know better than to actually disagree with you. So there's nothing you said that I disagree with. I was talking purely about the propane delivery framework, but you're absolutely right that those larger issues, I wasn't talking about those.
Okay,
and
thank you.
Clearly would be different.
And we are collecting those inputs as well, Tony, so thanks for bringing that up.
Okay.
So we've got the tax revenue paid throughout the Upper Peninsula, and then I think there was some interest in trying to figure out energy, electricity use at pump stations, that sort of thing. So totally hear what you're saying.
Thank you.
Yep, part of the mix, for sure. It's complicated.
As we've
It's
said.
our Facebook status. The Energy Task Force, it's complicated. Other inputs?
Can I add a little bit
Of
to
course.
the complexity?
Sure, that's what we're here for.
So since
We're
we're
on the table.
the complexity, right? So if we are to start, and again, this might not be pertinent or directly pertinent to the current charge, but I would argue it definitely is pertinent to the 2021 report. So if we're looking for a cumulative economic impact, right? So we've discussed energy efficiency, we've discussed some substitutes or co-use, say propane and something else. At least the data that I use in my courses suggests that things like energy efficiency have a higher employment per unit of energy ratio than, say, fossil fuel. So again, sort of, when this analysis, when the time comes from this analysis, I think it would be important for us to see the overall impact on jobs and jobs in the UP in particular, since I would argue that most of the value will be created here if it is energy efficiency, because you don't outsource much of it. Maybe installation comes from somewhere, but most of the work comes from the actual site.
Okay. Well, we're going to try to synthesize what we're hearing and then look forward to your reaction, and know that you all come at this work with a pretty deep perspective in your own worlds, and so look forward to you kind of adding value based on your backgrounds. So that'll be something that'll be important to come from you. Okay. Other thoughts? You're not going to break my heart if we feel like we've wrapped up our discussion early, but I also want to make sure that there's opportunity for discussion here today. I think we're slowing down.
Good meeting.
Okay. All right, great. With that, it is 10 after 3. So the task force meets again on December 10th. As I mentioned, we're going to do it in kind of 2 venues. So we'll get back to you with information about participating from Northern and Marquette. And then folks that are downstate can participate from Lansing. So we'll get that information to you. We're also working on establishing a 2020 schedule and hope to have that to you before we get together on the 10th. I think we're pretty close to offering up some suggested dates to all of you for input. I'm trying to think if there's any other logistics. Kimber? No? Okay. I think we've done what we need to do here today. So just a huge thank you again to the task force. I mean, I can't appreciate enough how much time and energy you all are putting into this. I know what a heavy lift it is, and I think that these conversations are fantastic, and I really appreciate your time and time and participation, so thank you. And thanks to all of you in the public who continue to join us. We appreciate it. The rooms get fuller every time, which I think is a really good sign. So with that, who knows how much snow's out there, so be safe, everybody. Thank you.